Hello story seekers. Welcome to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to help you drift off to sleep. And I'm here to deliver. But before we begin, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Now, get comfy, turn off the lights, and let your mind wander as I take you through tonight's story. It was just like any other night shift. I worked as a security guard at an old, sprawling warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building was massive, a relic of industrial times, now sitting mostly abandoned, save for a few late-night deliveries and the occasional worker who'd come in to sort inventory. My shift started at 10 o'clock, and I was in charge of walking the halls, checking the cameras, making sure everything was secure. There was nothing exciting about it. The hours dragged on. The fluorescent lights flickered occasionally, and the quiet hum of the air conditioning was the only sound that accompanied my lonely shift. I got used to it, honestly. It became routine, predictable. And that's what I loved about it, predictability. I could get lost in my thoughts as I walked the empty corridors, listening to the sounds of my boots on the concrete floor echoing off the walls. The place had an eerie feel, but it wasn't enough to unsettle me. It had always been this way. The only real company I had was the occasional call from the office, checking in, asking if everything was all right. And most of the time, I was the only person there, the only one keeping watch over the sprawling complex. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady. There was no pressure, no deadlines. And for someone like me, that was exactly what I needed. On nights like this, the warehouse was as quiet as ever. The only light came from the flickering fluorescent bulbs above, casting long shadows in the otherwise empty hallways. I'd start in the same place, walking the aisles of the warehouse floor, checking for anything out of the ordinary. A couple of hours into my shift, I'd do my usual round stop by the loading docks, make sure all the doors were locked, and then head up to the second floor to check the offices. But that night, something was different. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first. The atmosphere was off, but it was subtle, so subtle that at first, I thought it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me. But as I continued my rounds, the unease started to grow. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It wasn't like the usual silence of the building. There was something else, a pressure in the air, a sense of heaviness that I hadn't felt before. It made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I remember walking down one of the long hallways when I heard a sound, faint at first, but clear enough to stop me in my tracks. It was a soft tapping, like someone knocking on a door from a distance. I froze, listening. The warehouse was empty, I was sure of it. No one else was supposed to be there. But the sound came again, a tap, 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 coming from somewhere down the hall. I looked around, but there was nothing. No doors were open, no lights flickering. Everything seemed in place, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out of place. I did what I'd always done in these situations. I brushed it off. I told myself it was probably just the building settling or the wind outside causing some vibrations. It wasn't uncommon for the old structure to make strange sounds, but that didn't ease the tension I felt in my chest. I continued my walk, but I couldn't help but feel more and more uneasy. The silence seemed to press in on me, thick and suffocating. As I made my way through the building, I began to notice more subtle things. Lights flickering in rooms I had just passed, a shadow moving at the edge of my vision. I'd stop, squinting into the darkness, but nothing was ever there when I looked. Still, the unsettling sensation lingered. It wasn't just the quiet. It was the anticipation, the feeling that something was about to happen, something I couldn't control. By the time I reached the second floor, the unease had fully taken hold of me. The air was thick, almost suffocating. The empty offices looked more like empty shells dimly lit by the overhead lights, their desks and chairs looking strangely out of place in the silence. I checked the doors, locked them one by one, but as I walked back down the hallway toward the stairwell, I heard the tapping sound again. This time, it was louder, more deliberate. I paused, my heart racing in my chest. I knew I was alone in the building, So where was the sound coming from? I stood still, listening, trying to pinpoint its origin. It came from down the hall, but the corridor was long, and the darkness at the end seemed to stretch on forever. I walked cautiously toward it, the faint echo of my footsteps on the hard floor the only sound in the vast emptiness. As I neared the end of the hall, the tapping stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence. I felt a shiver run down my spine, and I couldn't help but feel like something was wrong. Something had changed in the air, something that made me feel uncomfortable, like I wasn't the only one in the building anymore. I turned around quickly, my mind racing, but all I saw was the long, empty hallway behind me. Nothing moved. Nothing stirred. It was as though the building itself had gone silent, waiting. The weight in the air grew heavier, and I could feel my pulse quickening. I walked back to the stairwell, my footsteps echoing louder now, and when I reached the door to the lower floor, I quickly locked it behind me. It was then that I realized whatever was happening, it wasn't just in my head. There was something wrong with this place, and as the minutes passed, the eerie sense of being watched grew stronger. The shift continued, but the unease never left me. I'd always prided myself on being level-headed, able to handle the monotonous solitude of the night shift without breaking a sweat. But this was different. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, like a slow, creeping presence that hung in the air, just beyond my sight. At first, it was subtle, small things that I almost chalked up to my imagination. It was a little after midnight when the first real incident happened. I had just finished my rounds on the second floor, checking the offices and storage rooms, and I was headed back to the main floor. The old elevator at the end of the hall stood open, its lights flickering dimly. I never used the elevator. It was unreliable and slow, and I preferred to take the stairs, but something about it caught my eye that night. The door was open, and I could see the faint reflection of the dim hallway lights on its scratched metal surface. It almost felt inviting, but the moment I walked past it, I heard it, the soft, unmistakable sound of a button being pressed. The elevator bell dinged once, as if someone had called the elevator to the floor. I froze in my tracks. My heart skipped a beat. The building was empty. There was no one else around, at least no one who should have been there. I glanced around the empty hallway, my pulse beginning to race. The elevator door stayed open, silent now, as if mocking me. I stood there for a moment, staring at the elevator, and then, deciding it was just some malfunction, I moved toward it to check. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but as I reached the door, I suddenly felt like the entire building had gone still, as if holding its breath. I stared inside. Empty. Just the worn floor and dim lighting. No one. I let out a nervous laugh and stepped back, shaking my head. Get it together, I muttered to myself. It had to be a glitch. The elevator had always been temperamental, but the feeling of unease lingered. It was as if the air had thickened, and I couldn't quite escape the sensation that something wasn't right. I decided to continue my rounds, pushing the bizarre incident to the back of my mind. I checked the cameras as I always did, scanning the monitors for any signs of movement, but everything seemed normal. Still, I couldn't stop looking at the spot where the elevator was parked. That strange noise kept echoing in my mind. It wasn't something I'd heard before, something faint but real, almost like a whisper. I told myself it was just a quirk of the building. Old structures like this one often had their share of odd noises and glitches. I was alone, and that alone could play tricks on the mind. But the more I tried to convince myself, the more uncomfortable I became. Later, I headed to the break room to grab a coffee. I'd only been gone for a few minutes, but when I returned to the main hallway, something was different. The door to the maintenance room, which I knew for sure had been closed earlier, was now cracked open. Not wide, just a sliver enough for me to notice. My heart rate picked up again. I knew I hadn't opened it. I approached the door cautiously, my hand on the flashlight I always carried. I nudged it open with my foot, the door creaking slightly. There was no one inside. It was empty, save for the usual equipment, a few cleaning supplies, some old boxes, and a small workbench cluttered with tools. The dim light from the hallway barely illuminated the space, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally across the floor. The strange thing wasn't the room itself, it was the air. The temperature had dropped. I could see my breath forming in the cold, thin mist as I stepped closer to the workbench. I felt a chill run down my spine. It was like the air had shifted, become thicker. I couldn't explain it, but I felt it, an oppressive weight that seemed to settle in my chest. I didn't stick around long. I quickly closed the door, locking it behind me. It's just the old air conditioning unit acting up, I told myself. Nothing more. But the doubt lingered. As the night went on, more things seemed off. The lights above flickered with greater frequency. They weren't just random flickers either. They pulsed as if in rhythm, one after another, like they were trying to tell me something. I rubbed my eyes as if to shake the feeling away, but it didn't help. The air felt even heavier now, and the strange sense of being watched was growing more intense. I kept my focus on the task at hand, though checking the monitors, patrolling the hallways, but I couldn't escape the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The worst part? It felt like the building was alive. The floors creaked in ways that weren't normal. The walls groaned as if they were stretching or shifting. Every now and then, I would hear a soft whispering sound, like voices carried on the wind. But when I stopped and listened, there was nothing, only silence. The kind of silence that presses on your ears and makes your head feel like it's going to explode. By now, my thoughts were racing. I tried to rationalize everything. Maybe the building's wiring was deteriorating, or the electrical systems were malfunctioning. It was an old place after all, and I was tired, exhausted from the long hours. Maybe that's why my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew there was more to it. This wasn't just tiredness or imagination. Around 3 o'clock, the tension was unbearable. I was standing in the warehouse section, near the loading docks, when I heard a sound, clear and undeniable this time. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, walking toward me. My heart skipped a beat. I turned, half expecting to see another guard, or maybe one of the late-night workers, but there was no one. The hallway was empty, save for the shadows stretching across the floor. The steps stopped, but I could still hear them. My pulse pounded in my ears as I stood frozen, staring down the hallway. I knew something was there, something was walking toward me, but I couldn't see it. It was like the footsteps were just part of the building itself, blending into the creaks and groans of the old structure. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "It's nothing," I whispered to myself, trying to calm my racing mind. "Just the building." But as I moved forward, the footsteps started again, this time faster, coming closer, almost in time with my own. I turned on my heels and sprinted back to the security office, my mind a whirl of panic. I locked the door behind me and sat in the chair, my hands shaking. The footsteps were still there, echoing in my mind, even though the hallway outside was empty. I didn't know what to think anymore. Was I losing my mind? Or was there something else in the building with me? I had no answers, only a growing sense of dread. And as I sat there, trying to catch my breath, I knew that I wasn't going to be able to shake this feeling, whatever it was, anytime soon. The following nights blurred into one long stretch of unease. I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was somehow watching me, that it was aware of my every move. The strange occurrences, once isolated to small, subtle events, were now happening with greater frequency. Each shift seemed to bring something new, something more intense, more impossible to explain. The building had become something more than just a structure to me. It had taken on a life of its own. I had tried to tell myself that it was just the fatigue, the loneliness of the night shift playing tricks on my mind. But with each passing day, I could feel the grip of something darker tightening around me. The sounds in the walls grew louder, the whispers more distinct. And now, it wasn't just the sounds that unnerved me. It was the feeling that something was waiting for me, lurking in the shadows, watching my every move. On the third night after the elevator incident, I returned to the maintenance room. The door had been left ajar again, just as it had been before. This time, I hesitated, staring at the crack between the door and the frame. The cold air seeped out, more pronounced than before. My breath fogged the air as I moved closer, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I pushed the door open with a shaky hand, stepping inside. The room was still empty, but the atmosphere was different. It was as if the room had taken on a weight of its own, a heaviness that pressed down on me from every angle. I could hear my own breathing, sharp and loud in the oppressive silence. I slowly walked to the workbench, my flashlight illuminating the cluttered surface. I scanned the tools and boxes, nothing out of place. But then I noticed something. There, in the corner, just beneath a stack of old newspapers, was a small, scratched piece of metal. It wasn't much, just a sliver of something shiny and out of place. It looked like a part of something larger, something broken. I bent down to examine it. My fingers brushed against the cold surface, and for a moment I felt something, a jolt of electricity that shot through my fingertips and up my arm. I recoiled, shaking my hand as if to rid it of the strange sensation. Get a grip, I muttered to myself. But I couldn't shake the feeling that this was important, that it was somehow connected to whatever was happening in the building. I pocketed the piece of metal, hoping it would give me some answers, but the nagging unease wouldn't leave me. I moved quickly out of the room, closing the door behind me, and returned to the security office. As I sat down in the chair, I looked over the monitors. The cameras were static, nothing unusual at first glance. But then, one of the cameras on the lower floor flickered. The image blinked out for a moment before returning, but when it did, something was different. The hallway on the screen was empty, but there was something in the air, something I couldn't see but could feel. The shadows seemed to shift and move, as if they had a life of their own. I leaned forward, squinting at the screen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then I saw a figure, standing in the far corner of the hallway. It was tall, and though its features were obscured by the shadows, I could tell it wasn't supposed to be there. I blinked, and when I looked again, the figure was gone. I rewound the footage, but it was the same. No one there. My mind raced. Was it a glitch? Or had I really seen something? I couldn't tell. But one thing was clear, the building had become more than just a place of work. It had turned into something alive. That night, I walked the halls with a sense of dread that grew heavier with each step. The lights flickered above me in a constant, rhythmic pattern, casting long, eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and writhe on their own. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing in on me, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors like a drumbeat. I checked every room, every corner, convinced that something would be there, waiting. But there was nothing. The only sounds were the creaks of the building settling, the hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Yet, it wasn't enough to reassure me. The feeling of being watched never left. The strangest thing happened when I reached the loading dock at the back of the building. As I approached, I noticed the heavy metal doors were slightly ajar, just enough for me to see a sliver of the empty parking lot outside. But the door had been closed when I made my rounds earlier. I knew it. I stood there, staring at the gap, unsure whether to push it open or leave it. The cold air from outside leaked through the crack, biting into my skin. I stepped closer, pressing my palm against the door. It was cold, unnaturally so, and I felt a shiver crawl up my spine as I slowly nudged it open. The room beyond was dark, the only light coming from the street lamps outside. But what I saw there froze me in place. There, in the far corner of the dock, was a figure. It was tall, its features indistinct in the shadows, but there was no mistaking the presence. It was standing perfectly still, as if it had been waiting for me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze. I could feel it watching me, studying me. My heart pounded in my chest as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. I took a hesitant step forward, my flashlight shaking in my hand. But before I could get any closer, the figure was gone. Vanished, as if it had never been there. I rushed back to the security office, my mind racing. I checked the monitors again, but the loading dock camera showed only an empty space. No figure, no movement. I was alone. But I knew I hadn't imagined it. I knew what I had seen. The next night, I went back to the loading dock, determined to find out what was going on. I waited there in the dark for hours, watching the shadows dance and stretch along the walls. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind that rattled the windows, seemed to bring the tension to a fever pitch. And then, just as the clock struck 2 a.m., I saw it again, the figure, standing in the same spot, waiting for me. This time, I didn't hesitate. I approached it, my hands trembling, my mind screaming at me to turn around, to run. But I had to know. I had to see it for myself. As I got closer, the air grew colder, the shadows more oppressive. And then, as if the building itself had opened its mouth to swallow me whole, the figure stepped forward. My breath caught in my throat as it moved, slow and deliberate, and I could see its face now, or rather, what should have been its face, an empty void, black and featureless, staring back at me. I turned to run, but before I could take another step, everything went dark. The air felt thick, heavy with an unspoken tension, as though the building itself was holding its breath. I was no longer in the loading dock. Somehow, I had ended up back in the security office, slumped in my chair, my body rigid with fear. My hands trembled as I gripped the armrest, trying to steady myself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. My mind was foggy, disoriented, and the image of the figure, its black, empty face, clung to my thoughts like a nightmare I couldn't escape. I glanced around the room. The monitors flickered, casting dim shadows on the walls, but everything seemed normal. The cameras showed nothing out of the ordinary. The building was still, quiet, as if nothing had changed. But deep down, I knew that I hadn't imagined what I had seen. I had felt it, the presence of something. Something that wasn't human, something that shouldn't have been there. And it was still here. I stood up, my legs unsteady beneath me, as I tried to shake off the disorientation. The building seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, the hallways dark and silent, the shadows more oppressive than ever. The sense of being watched, of being hunted, clung to me like a whisper just beyond my ear. I had to find out what was happening. I had to face whatever was haunting this place, once and for all. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls as I walked, each step feeling heavier than the last. I passed the maintenance room again, the door slightly ajar, just as it had been every night. I could feel a strange pull, a compulsion to go inside, but I resisted. I knew better now. Whatever was in that room, whatever had been waiting for me, wasn't something I could confront without more answers. I made my way to the lower floors, the ones that had always seemed untouched, forgotten. The air was colder down here, and the walls seemed to close in on me, the flickering lights casting long, jagged shadows that stretched and twisted as I walked. The building had grown more oppressive, more suffocating, with each passing day, and now it felt as if it were alive, aware of my every move. I reached the end of the hallway, where the old storage room stood. The door was wide open, the darkness inside beckoning me. I hesitated for a moment, my mind screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't stop now. Not when I was so close. I stepped inside. The room was musty, filled with the smell of old wood and dust. But there was something else, something sharp and metallic that made my stomach churn. I could feel it before I saw it, the change in the atmosphere, the weight of the room pressing in on me. The walls seemed to pulse, as if alive, as if the very foundation of the building was breathing. And then I saw it. At the far end of the room, beneath a pile of forgotten crates, lay the figure. It was crumpled on the floor, lifeless, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. The face, no, the absence of a face was turned toward me, its black void staring back with an emptiness that sent a cold shiver down my spine. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. The world around me seemed to crumble, as if the very air had turned to stone, suffocating me in its grip. My pulse raced, my hands shaking uncontrollably as I stared at the figure, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. It wasn't supposed to be here. It wasn't supposed to be real. But it was. A voice, deep and guttural, seemed to rise from the shadows, vibrating through the air. It wasn't a voice I could hear with my ears, but one I felt in the pit of my stomach, a low growl that resonated within me. It whispered in a language I couldn't understand, a sound that made my skin crawl and my heart race. I tried to back away, but my legs wouldn't move. The thing began to shift, its body twisting and contorting in ways that were impossible, inhuman. Its limbs elongated, its form stretching and warping, as if the very fabric of reality was bending around it. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But I was frozen, trapped in this nightmare that had become my reality. And then it spoke directly into my mind. You shouldn't have come here. The words weren't spoken aloud, but I could hear them clearly in my thoughts, feel them like a heavy weight pressing against my skull. They were cold, devoid of emotion, as if the creature had no use for fear, no need for sympathy. It was beyond that. It was beyond everything. You have awakened it. I tried to speak, tried to ask what it meant, but the words caught in my throat. My breath came in shallow gasps, my chest tight with panic. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The building, no. The thing that had taken over the building was all around me now, its presence pressing in from every angle, suffocating me. The creature, if that's what it was, moved closer, its form shifting and twitching like something alive, something monstrous. I could feel its cold presence before I even saw it, the darkness closing in around me, the air thick with the stench of decay. I had to get out. I didn't know how, but I ran. My body moved on instinct, my mind a blur of terror and confusion as I sprinted down the hallway, my breath ragged in my chest. The walls seemed to stretch forever, the darkness swallowing everything in its path, until there was only the sound of my footsteps echoing louder, faster, as if the building itself were chasing me. I reached the stairs and stumbled up them, my hands grasping the railing for support as I pulled myself higher, further away from the thing that had followed me into this nightmare. But no matter how fast I ran, no matter how many corners I turned, I couldn't escape the feeling that it was right behind me, that it was always there, just out of sight, waiting. I reached the rooftop and gasped for air, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The night sky above me was still, the stars distant and cold. But it didn't matter. The building was still with me, pressing against my mind, suffocating me. And then I saw it. The figure, standing at the edge of the roof, its black void of a face, staring into the distance. It's not over, the voice whispered in my mind, low and menacing. The silence on the rooftop was deafening. I stood there, frozen, staring at the figure. No, the entity standing at the edge, its black, featureless face unmoving, like some twisted monument to despair. Every nerve in my body screamed for me to flee, to run as far as I could from the nightmare that had consumed this building, but my legs refused to cooperate. I felt trapped, cornered, suffocated by the weight of the creature's presence. It's not over, the voice had whispered, and even now I could hear its chilling echo inside my mind. It was as if the words were etched into my consciousness, a constant reminder that escape was impossible, that there was no safe place to hide. I had to make a decision. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't let this thing take control of me, consume me like it had the building. But I couldn't go back down either. Not with the creature still lurking in the shadows, waiting, watching. I turned toward the door leading back inside, my heart pounding in my chest. My breath was ragged, each inhale a desperate attempt to calm myself, but it was futile. The air was thick with dread, every corner of the building now tainted by the entity's presence. I knew that if I went back in, I would be walking into its grasp, into whatever hell it had planned for me. But what choice did I have? I forced myself to move, my legs shaky but determined. I pushed the door open and stepped back into the dimly lit hallway, the soft hum of the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The building was eerily still, too still, and I could feel the weight of the atmosphere pressing down on me as I moved through the familiar corridors, the sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. Every turn I took felt wrong, as if the building itself had become a maze, its walls closing in around me. The weight of the entity's presence was everywhere now, in every crack in the walls, in every flicker of light. I could feel it watching me, waiting for me to slip up, to make a mistake. The elevators were ahead. I had to get out. I had to find a way to escape this nightmare. My hand trembled as I pressed the button to call the elevator, the metallic sound echoing through the empty hallway. Each second felt like an eternity, the anticipation growing with each passing moment. The elevator doors finally opened with a soft chime, but I hesitated before stepping inside. The building seemed to hum with a life of its own, as though it had become a living, breathing thing, and the elevator was just another part of its sinister design. I could hear the faintest rustling sound, like something moving in the darkness, and my heart skipped a beat. I wasn't alone. The doors closed behind me with a soft thud, and the elevator began its descent. As I descended through the floors, the oppressive silence only grew, each passing floor making my skin crawl. The lights flickered again, casting strange shadows that seemed to twist and contort at the edges of my vision. I gripped the railing, my knuckles white, as the elevator moved lower. The silence was unbearable, and the weight of my own fear was suffocating. The figure of the thing was still out there, somewhere in the building, its presence pressing against my chest, making it hard to breathe. The elevator jolted to a stop. The door slid open. I didn't wait. I sprinted down the hallway, not looking back, not daring to stop. The building seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me, each step I took bringing me closer to the exit. But it felt like I was walking through a nightmare I couldn't escape. I could hear the sound of something following me, a soft, dragging noise that seemed to echo through the empty halls. My pulse quickened, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I could feel the creature's presence, its cold, malevolent energy reaching out to ensnare me. But I couldn't stop. I couldn't let it catch me. I reached the back door. The dim light outside was a welcome sight, a beacon of hope in the suffocating darkness of the building. I yanked the door open, stumbling out into the cold night air. My lungs burned as I inhaled the fresh, clean air, but it wasn't enough to shake the feeling that something was still with me. Something was still watching from the shadows. I didn't stop running. I ran until my legs burned, until the city lights became a distant blur. The streets were empty, and the world seemed oddly quiet, as if the nightmare I had just endured had swallowed everything around me. The sensation of being hunted never left me, the cold, empty stare of the creature lingering in my mind. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself to stop and catch my breath. I didn't know what had happened, or why it had happened. The building, the entity, the strange events, it didn't make sense. There were no answers, no explanations, just an overwhelming sense of fear and confusion that had taken hold of me and refused to let go. As I stood there, my chest heaving with exhaustion, I realized something. The nightmare wasn't over. It wasn't over for me, and it wasn't over for anyone who might ever step foot into that building again. I had escaped, but the entity, the thing that had been waiting for me, was still out there, waiting for its next victim, its next opportunity to strike. I had no idea what it wanted or why it had targeted me, but I knew one thing for certain. It wasn't done with me. Not yet. I don't know if the building still stands, or if anyone else has ever stepped inside since that night. But I do know this. Some places are better left unexplored, some things better left undisturbed. And no matter how far I run, I can't shake the feeling that it's still watching. It's been years now, yet the memories of that night still haunt me. I thought that time would dull the edges, that the terror would fade into something less sharp, less vivid. But it hasn't. The images still linger, unwelcome and relentless, like a shadow that clings to you no matter how hard you try to outrun it. I don't go near that part of town anymore. I don't even drive past it. If I catch a glimpse of that building, its dark, crumbling facade, still standing in some twisted monument to whatever it became. I can feel the panic rise in my chest all over again. I wonder sometimes if it's still there, if it's still waiting for someone else to step through its doors, or if it has somehow been changed. More than just a building now. More than just a place. I've tried to tell people what happened, but how do you explain something like that? How do you describe the feeling of being hunted by something that doesn't even belong in this world? Most people don't believe me, and the ones who do just shake their heads, offering sympathy but no real understanding. They think I'm crazy, or that I'm just another victim of stress and exhaustion. But I know the truth. I know what I saw, what I felt. It's strange. The world is full of things that don't make sense, things that are too terrifying to even contemplate, and yet life goes on. People go to work, to school, to the grocery store, completely unaware of the things that exist in the corners, in the dark spaces between realities. They're too focused on their daily lives, too wrapped up in their own problems, to notice the creeping dread that sits just beneath the surface. But I see it now. I know it's there, and I can't unsee it. I've tried to move on. I've tried to put the past behind me, to live a normal life. I found a new job, a new routine, a new place to live. I've even tried therapy, talking to someone who's supposed to help me make sense of the terror that still lingers in my mind. But the thing is, you can't just get over something like this. There's no neat little package to wrap it up and put away in the back of your mind. The fear, the anxiety, the doubt, they're always there, just below the surface, waiting for a crack to form so they can crawl back out. I still wake up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, heart racing. It's always the same, those same oppressive shadows, that same feeling of being watched. The same chilling voice that whispers in the back of my mind. It's not over. No matter how much I tried to convince myself it was just a nightmare, a figment of my exhausted imagination, I know it was real. I know it was more than that. The entity, or whatever it was, is still there, somewhere. I don't know where, and I don't know how, but I feel its presence even now, like a cold breath on the back of my neck, like a hand reaching out from the darkness. I've learned to live with the fear, at least on some level. It's become a part of me, a constant companion. I've tried to find some peace, but I've come to accept that there's no peace to be found here. Not for me. Not anymore. The building, that place, will always haunt me. But it's not just the building. It's everything that came with it, the realization that there are things in this world, things that defy explanation, that can't be understood by the logic of human minds. And knowing that they exist, that they're out there, lurking just beyond the veil of what we see, is a terror that no one should ever have to face. I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't left when I did. What if I had stayed? Would the thing have claimed me, like it did with those who came before me? Would I have become part of the building's twisted history, another shadow in the halls? Or would I have been consumed by the darkness that seemed to feed off fear, that seemed to thrive in the place where reality broke down? I'll never know. And maybe that's the scariest part of all the uncertainty. The fact that there's no closure. No neat ending. Just the lingering question. What was it? I've come to realize that some things are better left unexplained. Some mysteries should stay buried. Because the more you try to understand, the more you open yourself up to the unknown, the more you risk being pulled into the darkness. And that's a risk I'm no longer willing to take. So I keep moving forward, one step at a time, never looking back. The fear will always be there, gnawing at the edges of my consciousness, but I try not to let it control me. The past is behind me, but it's never truly gone. It's a shadow that stretches long, a constant reminder that some places, some things, are better left forgotten. And as for that building, I don't know what became of it. Maybe it's still standing, its windows dark, waiting for the next soul foolish enough to enter. Or maybe it's gone, swallowed up by time and decay, leaving only whispers in the wind. I've been working as a maintenance technician in a large office building for a couple of years now. It's a place that, on the surface, seems like any other office complex in the city's sterile, quiet, and filled with the hum of fluorescent lights and the clinking of keyboards. But after what happened to me, I started to see it differently. The building holds a kind of weight to it now, an oppressive feeling that wasn't there before. The company I work for isn't a flashy one, but it's steady. The building itself is old, probably close to 50 years, maybe more, but it's been well maintained. It sits in the heart of downtown, nestled between newer, shinier skyscrapers. On most days, it's business as usual. I arrive early in the morning, check in with the security guard, and get started with my usual rounds changing light bulbs, fixing plumbing, repairing broken doors, things like that. It's all routine, and that's the way I like it. But there was something different about that building, something I never noticed at first. At least, not until my regular duties began to turn strange. The staff in the building was small, not more than a few dozen employees on any given floor. Most of them were office workers, a few managers, and a couple of support staff. There were a few odd characters, sure, but that was to be expected in any workplace. I was just one of the many faces that passed through the lobby every morning. My routine kept me busy and allowed me to interact with almost every part of the building floors that seemed a little more worn down. Corners that weren't used often, basements and hallways that had long ago become forgotten. No one really talked about them, but I knew them well. Over time, I started to notice little things in those neglected spaces. The kind of things you might chalk up to imagination at first, but the more I saw them, the more they started to feel real. This wasn't some creepy old house or a spooky, abandoned building. It was an office complex with people working in it every day. But it wasn't long before I started to hear things when no one was around. The building's quiet, yes, but it's never completely silent. There's always the sound of the HVAC system running in the background, the occasional hum of the elevator moving, or the soft shuffle of footsteps in the hallways. But it was one specific sound that caught my attention. Every once in a while, I'd hear a scraping sound from one of the storage closets on the lower floors. At first, I assumed it was just something shifting, maybe a stack of paper or old equipment that had settled. But there was a certain rhythm to it, something deliberate. Something waiting. Most days, I would just push it aside as my imagination. After all, maintenance workers are used to hearing strange noises in old buildings. The pipes creak, the walls settle. It's part of the job. But one evening, as I was working late on a project, I decided to check the lower floor storeroom. The noise had been growing louder in the past few weeks, and I figured it was time to get to the bottom of it. I grabbed my flashlight, made my way down the dark hall to the back of the building. The further I walked, the more the atmosphere shifted. The air felt colder here, and the silence was heavy, as though the building was holding its breath. It was odd this hallway was never used much, except for storage. No one came down here often, not unless there was something to fix or clean. But even then, I wasn't used to the sense of isolation that had begun to settle over this part of the building. As I approached the storage room door, I noticed it was slightly ajar. I don't remember leaving it like that. I always made sure to close doors behind me when I finished working. A strange unease crept up my spine, but I shook it off. I was just being paranoid, I told myself. Probably nothing more than an old fan or some equipment shifting. I pushed the door open slowly, my flashlight illuminating the empty shelves stacked with old boxes and discarded office supplies. It looked just like any other storage closet in the building, nothing out of the ordinary. But then I heard it again. That scraping sound. It was coming from behind one of the boxes at the far end of the room. My heart rate sped up, my pulse quickening with each step I took toward the noise. I couldn't explain why, but I felt drawn to it, like something was waiting for me. I moved the box aside, and that's when I saw it. At first, it seemed like nothing more than an old pipe or perhaps a piece of broken equipment. But as I crouched down, flashlight in hand, I realized what it was. A small hatch in the floor. A hatch that I had never noticed before. despite the countless hours I'd spent in this building. The edges were rusted, and the wood surrounding it had warped with age. The scraping noise had come from within. I knelt down closer, feeling a chill sweep over me as I touched the edge of the hatch. Something was definitely inside. I couldn't take my eyes off the hatch. It was small, weathered, almost as if it didn't belong in this building at all. It didn't make sense. I had worked in this place for years, and I was certain that no one had ever mentioned a hatch in the floor. Certainly no one had talked about it being part of the building's design. A wave of confusion hit me as I crouched there, staring at the rusted edges, my breath catching in my throat. The scraping sound had stopped, but the eerie silence that followed made the air feel thick, almost oppressive. I reached down to grip the metal handle of the hatch, testing its resistance. It wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, my fingers slipping from the rusted surface. It felt like an eternity, but I knew I had to open it. Whatever was making that sound had to be inside. It was only logical, right? My fingers trembled as I pressed down on the hatch one last time, the metal creaking under the pressure. The thing that had been scraping in the dark had to have come from here. I wasn't sure if I was prepared for what I might find. With a final push, the hatch opened slightly, and I could feel the stale air rising from below. It smelled like dust, old wood, and something I couldn't quite place. The smell stung my nose, and I had to pull back momentarily to steady myself. I stood up, wiping my hands on my work pants, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. I had no idea what I was getting myself into, but I knew that I couldn't leave this mystery unsolved. I grabbed the flashlight, turning the beam downward toward the hole. It looked like a small tunnel, a cramped passageway that led to a space below. I hesitated for a moment. Something deep in my gut told me not to go down there, but curiosity won out. I wasn't the type to back down from a challenge, and besides, I was a professional. Maintenance workers don't get scared. I had fixed pipes, electrical systems, and broken doors. How much different could this be? I crouched down, pushing the beam of light into the darkness, and that's when I noticed it. There were faint scratches along the walls of the tunnel, like someone or something had crawled through there recently. The marks were fresh, too fresh to have been left by anyone years ago. My heart pounded in my chest, but I couldn't turn back now. I had to know what was down there. Just as I was about to climb down, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps coming from above, followed by the muffled murmur of voices. I froze. There was no one supposed to be here at this hour. The building had emptied out hours ago. The only ones still here were the security guard and me. I stood still, waiting for the sound to stop. But it didn't. The footsteps grew louder, echoing down the hallway above me. The voices became clearer, though they were indistinct, almost as if they were whispering in a language I didn't recognize. I should have gone upstairs immediately. I should have left that hatch alone. But I couldn't tear myself away from the hole in the floor. The part of me that had always prided myself on solving problems, on fixing things, was demanding answers. I quickly grabbed a nearby broomstick, cautiously lowering it into the tunnel to see how deep it went. The sound of the broom scraping against the floor of the tunnel sent a chill up my spine. Then, as I pulled it back up, something else happened. The scrape turned into a loud bang, as if something or someone had hit the wall of the tunnel from below. I dropped the broomstick, my heart racing. It felt like the building itself was alive, trying to communicate with me in some way I couldn't understand. I stood there in the dim light of the flashlight, waiting for something else to happen, but the silence returned. The voices and footsteps above had stopped. There was no longer any sound except the thumping of my own heartbeat. I didn't know what to do. Should I investigate further, or was I risking something worse by going down there? Part of me wanted to run, to leave that hatch and never return. But the other part of me, the curious, determined part, was still anchored in place, unable to let go. After what felt like an eternity, I finally made the decision to close the hatch. As I lifted it back into place, I noticed something odd. There were small, almost invisible handprints on the edges of the opening. They were smeared, like someone had tried to open it from below. I froze. My stomach twisted in knots. I hadn't seen any handprints when I first found the hatch, but now they were there, real, undeniable evidence that something had been down there, something that had been trying to get out. My mind raced. What was going on in this building? What had I stumbled upon? I stood there for a long time, my mind replaying the events over and over. The sounds, the strange markings, the feeling of being watched. But there was nothing more I could do. I closed the storage room door behind me, locked it, and turned to leave. But as I walked down the hallway, something stopped me dead in my tracks. The temperature had dropped. The air felt colder, sharper, as though the building itself had shifted. I couldn't explain it, but the feeling of dread that had settled over me felt different now, more intense, more real. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself that I was just being paranoid. But when I reached the elevator, I paused. The elevator light was blinking, its button glowing faintly in the darkness. The elevator was on the ground floor, but I could hear something moving inside. It was almost as if someone was waiting for the door to open, but there was no one there. I quickly pushed the button to call the elevator up, but when the door finally opened, it was empty. I stepped inside, but as the doors closed, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The days that followed were a blur of strange occurrences. At first, I tried to convince myself that what had happened in the storage room was just a freak accident, a trick of the mind. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't shake the sense that the building had changed, that it was holding something in the shadows, waiting. The elevator incident only added to my growing unease. I had hoped it was just a malfunction, something that could be fixed with a quick call to the technician. But as the days wore on, more and more unsettling events began to unfold. Little things, mostly. A flickering light here, a door that wouldn't stay closed there. But each time I encountered these oddities, they felt like little pieces of a puzzle I wasn't meant to solve. The first real shift in the atmosphere came a few days after the elevator incident. I was walking down the hall late one evening, making my rounds, when I noticed the strange humming sound again. It was faint at first, a soft vibration that seemed to come from beneath the floor. At first, I thought it was just the pipes old buildings have a way of making strange noises, especially in the quiet of the night. But this sound was different. It had a rhythmic quality to it, like something mechanical, something alive, pulsing under the surface. I couldn't ignore it. The sound seemed to follow me, growing louder as I walked toward the back of the building, closer to the areas I'd never ventured into before. The sound led me to a narrow hallway, one I didn't remember being there during my previous inspections. It felt out of place, as if it had been hidden away, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. My heart raced as I took a few steps down the hall. The air grew colder, thick with the scent of something old, decay, dust, and something else I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't just the smell, though. The very atmosphere felt different. The lights overhead flickered once more, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. I reached the end of the hallway and stopped in front of a door I had never seen before. It wasn't on the building's blueprints, not that I could remember. The handle was cold, its surface cracked and worn, as if it hadn't been touched in years. My breath came out in visible puffs as I stood there, hesitating. It felt like the door had been waiting for me. I had no reason to open it, no real justification for stepping into whatever was behind that door. But I couldn't turn back now. My curiosity and my need for answers compelled me forward. I pushed the door open. The room inside was dark, only faintly illuminated by the light spilling in from the hallway behind me. The air felt heavier in here, oppressive, as though the room was holding its breath. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The walls of the room were covered in what looked like marking scratches, deep gouges that ran across the plaster in jagged lines. They seemed to form some kind of pattern, though I couldn't make sense of it. It was as if something had been trying to claw its way out of the walls, something desperate. I took a step forward, my flashlight casting sharp beams across the room. There were more signs of rare objects strewn across the floor, overturned chairs, and papers scattered everywhere. It looked like the room had been ransacked, as if someone or something had been searching for something. I moved further in, my footsteps echoing off the bare walls. As I approached the far corner, I felt the unmistakable sensation of being watched. I spun around, half expecting to see someone standing there in the shadows, but there was no one. Still, the feeling lingered, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I couldn't explain it, but I had the undeniable sense that I wasn't alone in this building anymore. Whatever was down there, whatever had been causing the disturbances, was getting closer. And it wasn't going to let me leave without uncovering the truth. I backed away from the room, my heart pounding in my chest. As I stepped into the hallway, I turned to look back, expecting to see the door silently swinging shut. But it wasn't closing. Instead, I saw something that made my breath catch in my throat. The markings on the doorframe had changed. I had seen them when I opened the door, simple, worn scratches that seemed like nothing more than age and wear. But now, they were fresh. They were new. Deep crimson streaks marred the once blank wood, and in the middle of the frame was a symbol that looked like a twisted, distorted figure, bent at unnatural angles. It was like something had been carved into the door with frantic urgency. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't even know if I should be standing there. But I couldn't move. I was frozen, staring at the doorframe, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. And then I heard it. A soft, guttural growl emanating from deep within the room. It wasn't human. It wasn't even animal. It was something else. Something that made the hairs on my neck stand at attention and my pulse race in terror. I didn't wait to hear more. I turned and ran, not caring if I looked back. I couldn't get out of there fast enough. But when I reached the elevator, my blood ran cold once again. The lights were out. The entire building was plunged into darkness. The only sound now was the pounding of my heart in my ears, the deep, rhythmic thumping that seemed to reverberate through the walls. The growl from earlier was still echoing in my mind, but it wasn't the only thing I could hear now. There were footsteps behind me. I didn't dare turn around. I could feel the presence, the weight of it pressing in on me from all sides. My instincts screamed at me to run, but the elevator doors refused to open. I pressed the button again, harder this time, and when they finally slid open, I stepped inside. The doors slammed shut behind me, and for a brief moment, I felt relief. I had escaped, at least for now. The elevator continued its slow descent, its hum vibrating through the metal cables, the oppressive darkness around me making the air feel even thicker. My heart was pounding, and it felt as if my chest was tightening with every second that passed. I didn't know if it was the building itself or something more sinister at work, but the fear had taken root in my bones. I had never been this afraid in my life. The whispering voice from before, "Get out," still echoed in my mind, growing louder with every passing moment. It wasn't just a voice, it was a command, an order that reverberated through my body, urging me to flee. But where could I go? The building was alive with something dark, something watching, something that didn't want me there. The deeper I went, the more it felt like the walls were closing in on me, like I was being drawn into a trap I couldn't escape. When the elevator finally reached the bottom floor, the doors opened with a groan, revealing a dark hallway ahead. I stepped out cautiously, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The building felt even colder here, the air thick with an unsettling quiet. No sounds of life, no signs of movement, just the echo of my own breathing. I moved forward, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. My feet felt heavy, as if the ground beneath me was pulling at me, reluctant to let me leave. The hallway stretched on longer than it should have, each step farther than the last. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck rise, the sensation of being followed creeping up my spine. And then I saw it. At the end of the hallway, the door that had once been sealed, the one that had been hidden away, was wide open. But this wasn't the same door. Something was different. The markings on the frame had changed again. and the air surrounding it was thick, suffocating. The room inside was dark, but I could make out shapes that shouldn't have been there. I didn't want to go closer, but my feet moved on their own, drawing me in against my better judgment. Every instinct in me screamed to turn around, to run, to get as far away from that room as possible. But I couldn't. The building wouldn't let me. And I knew, deep down, I had to find out what was happening. I had to know what was behind that door. As I stepped inside, the temperature dropped. My breath fogged in front of me, the chill biting at my skin. But it was the sight before me that made my blood run cold. The walls were covered in those same strange markings again. But now they were more than just scratches. They had taken shape, forming words, symbols, a language I couldn't understand. It was like something ancient, something dark and forgotten, had been scrawled across the walls in desperate frenzy. And at the center of the room, illuminated by the faint beam of my flashlight, was a figure. A shadow! It was hard to describe like a person, but not. Its form was wrong, twisted, as though it had been bent out of shape, its limbs contorted at unnatural angles. It was crouched, its head lowered toward the ground, its back arched in a way that no human body could ever bend. The air around it seemed to shimmer, warping the space in a way that made my stomach churn. I couldn't tell if it was real or just a figment of my overactive imagination, but everything in me screamed that it was real, that it was waiting. I took a step forward, my breath shallow, my mind struggling to process what I was seeing. The flashlight flickered, and for a split second, the figure seemed to vanish, only to reappear closer, its distorted face now inches from mine. The skin was pale, slick, and stretched taut over its skull, its eyes hollow, empty black pits. I felt its gaze, though, and it was more than just a look, it was a presence, an overwhelming force that seemed to fill every inch of the room. My legs gave out, and I stumbled back, my heart racing. The air was suffocating now, thick with the stench of decay, the pungent scent of something rotting. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It was as if the very air had stolen my voice, leaving me mute, powerless. And then it moved. It was fast, too fast. In the blink of an eye, the thing shot toward me, its limbs twitching and jerking in unnatural ways, the sound of its movements like bones snapping. I barely had time to react before it was on me, its cold, clammy hand wrapping around my wrist with a grip that felt like iron. The pressure was unbearable, like it was trying to pull me into the depths of the room, into the dark space where it had come from. I fought against it, desperately trying to break free, but the more I struggled, the tighter its grip became. The room seemed to close in around me, the walls pressing in with an almost physical force. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I thought I was going to pass out. But then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the thing let go. The pressure released, and I stumbled backward, my heart still racing, my chest heaving with panic. The figure didn't follow me, but it didn't need to. I could feel it watching me, its presence lingering in the shadows, the air around me thick with its malice. I turned and ran, as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The sound of my feet pounding against the floor was deafening in the silence, the pounding of my heart in my ears drowning out everything else. But no matter how fast I ran, the feeling of being chased never left. It was like the building itself was alive, chasing me, pushing me towards something I didn't want to face. I burst out of the hallway and into the elevator, slamming the button for the ground floor, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The doors slammed shut, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I allowed myself a moment to breathe. But it wasn't over. I could still feel the thing's gaze on me, burning into the back of my mind. The elevator started its slow journey up, and I closed my eyes, praying it would end. But when I opened them again, I saw the last thing I ever wanted to see. The elevator jolted to a stop with a violent shake, the sound of the metal grinding against metal so harsh it almost drowned out the ringing in my ears. My breath was coming in ragged bursts, my chest heaving with each desperate inhale, but it didn't matter. The figure of the thing was still there, its cold eyes locked onto mine, its ghastly presence so close I could feel it crawling under my skin. I stumbled out of the elevator the moment the doors opened, feeling like I had just narrowly escaped something that was far beyond my understanding. The cold, musty air of the lobby wrapped around me, offering no comfort as my feet carried me toward the exit. Every step felt like an eternity, each movement a struggle to regain control over my body, which had already given in to panic. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The main doors of the building were ahead, the soft glow of the streetlights just outside offering a faint sense of safety. As I reached the door, my hand trembling on the cold handle, I heard it a soft sound, almost like a whisper, carried on the wind. I froze. My pulse spiked. There, in the periphery of my vision, I saw the thing, standing motionless just outside the entrance, staring at me through the glass. Its form was shrouded in darkness, but I knew it was there. I could feel its eyes boring into me. I yanked the door open with every ounce of strength I had left, nearly tearing the handle off as I stepped out into the night. The cool air hit my face, and for a brief moment, I thought I had escaped it. I thought it was over, but the feeling of being watched lingered, oppressive and suffocating. My heart still hammered in my chest, the weight of what I had experienced pressing down on me. I stumbled down the stairs of the building, my legs shaky, my head spinning. The streets were eerily quiet, the only sound the distant hum of city traffic. The building behind me loomed in the darkness, its windows dark, its shape distorted by the fog rolling in from the river. But I didn't dare look back. I couldn't. I didn't want to know if it was still following me, if it was still waiting for me. I ran down the street, not caring where I was going, just needing to put as much distance between me and that building as possible. I don't know how long I kept moving, how many blocks I crossed before I finally allowed myself to slow down. But even then, the feeling of being watched didn't fade. It stayed with me, an invisible weight pressing against my shoulders, pulling me down with each step. By the time I reached a small coffee shop, I was barely able to stand. I pushed the door open, the bell above it ringing softly, and collapsed into a booth near the back. The warm, comforting scent of coffee filled the air, and I let out a shaky breath. The normalcy of the place, the soft chatter of the people around me, should have been soothing, but it only made me feel more disconnected from everything. Like I was in a world that didn't make sense anymore. My hands were shaking as I ordered a coffee, trying to steady my nerves. The barista smiled, but there was a glint of something in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. It was like he knew, like he could sense the fear rolling off me in waves. When the coffee arrived, I drank it too quickly, the warmth not quite enough to chase away the chill that had settled deep inside me. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I had to go back, right? I had to find out what was happening, why that thing was there, and what it wanted. But the thought of returning to that building, to that room, filled me with a terror I couldn't explain. I glanced at my phone, the screen still cracked from the last time I dropped it. I tried to call anyone, but the calls went unanswered. I sent messages, but they sat in my outbox, waiting for a reply that never came. I couldn't bring myself to reach out to the others who had worked in that building. They wouldn't understand. They couldn't. It wasn't just the thing I had seen that haunted me, it was the building itself. There was something wrong with it, something dark hidden within its walls. And I realized then that I couldn't ignore it. Not anymore. The terror I felt wasn't just a momentary thing, it was part of something far larger, something more insidious. I knew I couldn't go back alone. I couldn't be the only one who knew what was happening. But I couldn't talk to anyone about it either. I didn't trust anyone enough to explain. What if they thought I was losing my mind? What if they couldn't see it, couldn't feel it, and I was just making it all up? I finished my coffee and left the shop, the streets now feeling emptier, quieter. As I walked back to my car, the weight of the building seemed to press in on me again, the darkness behind it reaching out, trying to claim me once more. The hairs on the back of my neck prickled, but I didn't turn around. I couldn't. The drive home was a blur, my mind spinning, my thoughts incoherent. I had to get away from the building, from the thing that was still out there, waiting. But deep down, I knew I couldn't run forever. I pulled into my driveway, the familiar sight of my house offering little comfort. As I walked to the front door, I turned, just once, to look at the dark outline of the building in the distance. Its silhouette loomed against the horizon, cold and imposing. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, the lights flickered. For a split second, the building was completely dark. I couldn't see anything through the windows. Nothing moved. But then, as if in response, the lights came back on. The windows illuminated, one by one. And at the top floor, the same floor where it had all begun, there was movement. A shadow moving slowly across the glass. I didn't stay to watch. Inside my house, I locked every door, every window. I made sure everything was secure, but the unease never left me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was still out there. And that building, it wasn't done with me. Not yet. Days passed, and the world outside my door seemed to return to normal, or at least I tried to convince myself it had. I went through the motions: work, meals, the humdrum of daily life, but everything felt off. The weight in my chest never fully lifted, the sense of being watched always lurking just beneath the surface. I knew it wasn't over. The thing, that shadow, that presence, it wasn't gone. It was still out there, somewhere. I tried to convince myself that I had simply imagined it, that the stress and fear had warped my perception of reality. After all, I had been alone in that building at night, my mind running wild as I explored the empty halls. It was easy to blame my own fear for what I had seen, but deep down, I knew the truth. I knew what I had experienced wasn't a figment of my imagination. The thing, whatever it was real. The strange events didn't stop either. I began to notice things that I had ignored before. At first, it was just subtle shifts, shadows that didn't quite match the light, small sounds that couldn't be explained. But then, one evening, as I walked past the old, abandoned building, I felt it again. That same crushing weight. That same icy chill that had enveloped me the night I'd first seen it. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to see what was waiting for me in the darkness of that building. But I knew I couldn't leave it alone either. The answers, the truth, were locked within those walls. I had to go back, even if it meant facing whatever it was that had been haunting me. It was late when I arrived. The city was quiet, the streets almost empty, the hum of traffic, a distant murmur in the background. The building loomed in the darkness, its windows dark, its shape imposing and cold. I stood there for a moment, staring up at it, my heart pounding in my chest. The memories of the things I had witnessed flooded back in an instant, the flickering lights, the whispers in the air, the presence that felt too close, too real. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door handle. But I couldn't stop now. I had to know what was going on. I had to find out if I was losing my mind, or if there really was something sinister at play. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the familiar smell of dust and decay rushing to greet me. The air inside was thick, stagnant, the silence almost suffocating. I took a step forward, the floorboards creaking under my weight. My footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, each sound louder than the last, until it felt like the building was responding to me. I was no longer alone. The lights flickered above me, casting long shadows that danced along the walls. The air seemed to hum with an electric charge, as though something was just on the other side of the threshold, waiting for me to take the next step. I moved cautiously, the sensation of being watched growing stronger with each passing second. And then I heard a soft, almost imperceptible sound, like a rustling of fabric or the shuffling of feet. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't alone. Someone or something was there. I turned the corner, and there it was. The thing I had seen before, the figure that had haunted my every step, stood in the hallway. It wasn't moving, but it was there, its presence filling the space like a dark cloud. Its eyes cold, unfeeling, like two pits of blackened despair locked onto mine. My blood ran cold. The air around me seemed to freeze, the world narrowing down to just me and that thing. I could feel its gaze, heavy and suffocating, like it was burrowing into my soul. My legs trembled beneath me, my body unwilling to move, to react. But then, as if in answer to some unspoken question, the thing raised its hand. Slowly, deliberately. It wasn't a gesture of greeting, nor one of peace. It was a command, a silent invitation to step closer. I wanted to run. I wanted to turn and flee, to escape the nightmare that was unfolding before me. But my feet wouldn't move. I couldn't look away. The thing's presence was all-encompassing, its hold on me absolute. It wasn't just in the room, it was in me, pressing against my chest, squeezing the air from my lungs. I took a step forward, against my will, the force of the thing pulling me closer. The world seemed to distort as I moved, the walls warping and stretching as if the building itself was bending to its will. My heart hammered in my chest, my breath shallow and quick, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't turn back. I was right in front of it now, standing mere inches from that cold, unfeeling gaze. The world around me seemed to drop away, leaving just the two of us in that infinite moment of silence. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The air around me returned to normal, the building suddenly still and silent again. The thing, whatever it had been, was no longer in front of me. I was standing alone in the hallway, my heart still racing, my hands shaking uncontrollably. It was the kind of evening where the air is thick with the weight of the unknown. The fading light of a dying day cast long shadows across the landscape, and the trees whispered their ancient secrets to the wind. I had been looking forward to this weekend for weeks, planning the trip with a couple of old friends, something simple yet perfect to unwind. We decided to venture out to a remote forest trail that I had read about in an old hiking guide, a place known for its tranquility and untouched beauty. The forest path was located deep in the heart of the countryside, far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. I was drawn to it for its promise of solitude and peace, away from the noise and distractions that come with daily life. After a long week, the idea of spending a weekend in the woods felt like the perfect escape. No phones, no emails, just the sounds of nature. What could go wrong? I was with two of my closest friends, both of whom shared my love for the outdoors. We'd spent countless hours hiking together in different parts of the country, from rolling hills to dense forests. We were all experienced enough to handle what lay ahead, or so we thought. The plan was simple. We would follow the trail, set up camp by a small stream we knew was nearby, and enjoy a few days of peace and quiet. As we made our way to the trailhead, everything seemed perfectly normal. The road that led us there was quiet, with only the occasional car passing by. We unloaded our gear from the back of the car and strapped on our backpacks. The forest path stretched out before us, winding through towering trees, with the occasional gap where the sky peeked through. The atmosphere was serene, nothing to suggest that anything out of the ordinary could happen. We started walking, and with each step, the sounds of the outside world faded away, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The trail itself was well marked, and we kept our pace steady, chatting and laughing along the way. The first few miles were nothing but peaceful, a typical hike through nature. We passed the time by sharing stories, reminiscing about past trips, and discussing random thoughts that came to mind. We walked for hours, the trail becoming more remote with each step. The deeper we went, the more the forest felt like it was closing in around us. The trees, once towering and welcoming, now seemed a little too close for comfort. But it wasn't anything to worry about, right? Just a bit of the typical wilderness feel that comes with a remote trail. The sun was beginning to set as we found a small clearing near the edge of the path, perfect for setting up camp. We worked together to pitch our tents and gather firewood, the usual chores that come with camping. The air was cooling rapidly, and the faint smell of pine and earth filled the air. As night fell, we sat around the campfire, talking about the day's hike and making plans for tomorrow's journey. The flickering light from the fire cast eerie shadows on the trees surrounding us, and the sounds of the forest grew louder with the darkening sky. It wasn't long before a feeling of unease settled over me, a sense that something wasn't quite right. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air felt thick, almost oppressive. My friends, on the other hand, were still in high spirits, joking and laughing as if everything was perfectly fine. I didn't want to seem like the worrywart, so I kept my thoughts to myself. After all, it was probably just the isolation getting to me. As we finished our meal, the last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, and the full moon began to rise above the trees. The forest looked different in the moonlight, shadowy and mysterious. But still, we stayed by the fire, not thinking much of it. It wasn't until later, when the fire had burned low and we were getting ready to sleep, that things began to shift in a way none of us could have expected. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard a rustling sound just beyond the trees. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but then it came again, closer this time. I strained my ears, but it was hard to make out. My thoughts wandered to animals, maybe a deer or some other nocturnal creature. But then I heard a low, almost guttural sound, like something or someone was moving in the underbrush. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone out there. I turned over in my sleeping bag and tried to ignore it, hoping it was just the forest settling for the night. But I couldn't sleep. My mind kept racing, and the rustling continued at intervals, almost rhythmic. It was unnerving. In the morning, I woke up feeling unsettled, though I tried to push the thoughts of the night aside. I assumed the noises were just wild animals after all. We broke camp and continued our hike, moving deeper into the forest. The day was crisp, the sky clear, and I started to feel a little better. But even as we trekked further along the trail, that strange feeling lingered, gnawing at the edges of my mind. We'd been hiking for most of the day, following the forest path as it twisted through the woods. The sun was starting to dip lower in the sky, casting long, distorted shadows across the trail. The further we moved into the forest, the quieter it became. I couldn't help but notice how still the trees seemed, almost too still, as though something was holding its breath. The path was narrow now, and the overhanging branches created a canopy that filtered the remaining light, casting everything in an eerie twilight. My friends were up ahead, chatting lightly, but I found myself lagging behind. The uneasy feeling from the previous night still clung to me, making it hard to shake the sense that we were being watched. At one point, I reached down to adjust my boot, and when I stood up, I saw something strange. The forest, which had been so silent, seemed to shift. The ground beneath me had been disturbed. A long trail of freshly broken branches lay across the path, as if something had recently passed through. But here's the odd part, there were no footprints. Just the snapped twigs and branches, scattered in a way that didn't make sense. It was as though a heavy force had moved through the area, but there was no trace of anything that could have caused it. I paused, looking at the scene. It was subtle enough that I could have easily written it off as a natural occurrence, but something about it felt wrong. I glanced up at the trees around me. No breeze, no movement. Everything was too still. "Hey, do you guys see this?" I called out to my friends, pointing to the broken branches. One of my friends, who had been walking ahead, turned around with a raised eyebrow. "What's up? Did you trip over something?" I shook my head, crouching down to examine the broken branches more closely. "No, look at this. Something moved through here recently, but there's no sign of footprints or anything else." I waved my hand around to indicate the surrounding area. "It's too clean." The other friend, who had been trailing behind, finally caught up and peered down at the ground. He looked just as confused as I felt. "That is weird," he admitted. "Probably just some animal, right? We are in the middle of the woods after all." But I wasn't so sure. The odd thing about the break in the branches was that it didn't feel random. It felt deliberate, as if something or someone had purposely left it behind for us to find. "We should keep moving," I said, standing up and brushing off my pants. "Let's not linger too long. I have a bad feeling about this." My friends didn't argue, but I could see the doubt on their faces. They were used to my overactive imagination, but they also knew I wasn't one to exaggerate. Still, we carried on, the atmosphere growing heavier with each step. As we continued, the forest began to feel even more oppressive. The air was thick, and the usual sounds of birds and small animals seemed to have faded into the background. It was just the sound of our footsteps crunching over the dry leaves and the occasional rustle of the wind through the branches. But even the wind felt strange, like it was holding something back. An hour later, we came across a clearing. It was a small one, the kind you'd expect to find along a well-traveled trail, with tall grass and a few rocks scattered about. It seemed like a good place to stop for a break, so we set our packs down and sat on the grass. That's when we heard it. A low, almost imperceptible sound, like a twig snapping. It wasn't the sound of the wind or any animal. It was deliberate, like something or someone was moving in the forest just beyond our sight. I looked up sharply, scanning the tree line. My friends froze as well, their eyes darting around in unspoken agreement. The sound was distant, but it was clear enough to catch our attention. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, barely loud enough for anyone to hear. One of my friends gave a nervous laugh, trying to brush it off. Probably just a deer or something, but I wasn't so sure. It wasn't the usual noise we'd hear in the woods. The air felt heavier, charged, like something was building up. We sat in silence for a moment, each of us listening intently. Then, another sound, this time louder, closer. The unmistakable crunch of something heavy moving through the underbrush. It wasn't the casual, light step of a deer or any other animal we might have expected. No, this was a deliberate, purposeful sound, and it was moving toward us. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. My heart began to beat faster, and the feeling of being watched returned, this time much stronger than before. "Okay, now this is getting weird," I muttered under my breath, looking at my friends. They seemed just as on edge as I was. "Maybe we should head back," one of them suggested, standing up abruptly. "Let's not push our luck." I nodded, my gut telling me it was a good idea. We gathered our things quickly, but as we turned to leave the clearing, the air shifted again. The once subtle rustling became more pronounced, and I could have sworn I saw something move between the trees in the distance. It was hard to make out, but it felt wrong. The shape seemed too large, too unnatural. I didn't say anything at first, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized we weren't alone in this forest. We started to move quickly, not running, but definitely picking up the pace. The feeling of unease hung over us like a dark cloud, and the path ahead seemed to stretch on forever. Every little sound, every crackling branch, every gust of wind made my skin crawl. Then, out of nowhere, something else happened that stopped us in our tracks. A loud, sharp cry. It sounded like something between a scream and a howl, echoing from deep within the woods. It was so sudden, so unexpected, that we all froze in place, our hearts pounding in our chests. We exchanged frightened looks, each of us unsure of what to do. That didn't sound like any animal," one of my friends whispered, his voice shaking. "No kidding," I muttered, trying to force the words out. What the hell was that? We stood there, frozen, listening as the sound echoed again, this time closer. Whatever it wasn't natural. It didn't belong in this forest. Our instinct was to flee, but the trail ahead suddenly felt like a maze. The woods had changed, as though the trees themselves had shifted in the dark, rearranging the path. Nothing made sense anymore. The forest no longer felt like a place of peace. It was as if we had entered something else, something ancient, something waiting for us. We didn't speak again as we started moving faster, almost running now. But no matter how quickly we went, the forest felt endless, stretching on in every direction. The once familiar path now felt like it was closing in, narrowing around us, as if we were trapped in the woods with no way out. The woods seemed to close in tighter with each step we took. We'd been walking for what felt like hours now, though I couldn't be sure how much time had passed. The air was colder than it had been when we started, and the once pleasant trail had become unfamiliar. We weren't just lost now, we were trapped in something we didn't understand. The forest had changed too. The trees, once tall and majestic, now seemed gnarled and bent, their limbs twisted in unnatural ways. The wind had picked up, but it was more like a constant, low hum that rattled the branches and sent chills down my spine. It wasn't the usual breeze you'd expect in the woods. There was something oppressive about it, like it was forcing its way through the branches, not just moving through them. We didn't talk much anymore, our breaths quick and shallow, as if the very act of speaking might break the fragile silence. Each of us was lost in our own thoughts, but the same question lingered in all of our minds. What was happening here? What were we walking into? Then, just when I thought it couldn't get any worse, the forest seemed to come alive with strange sounds. They were faint at first, just a rustling in the distance, but soon they became more distinct. The soft scrape of something against bark, the occasional snap of a twig, as though something was moving just out of sight. It wasn't an animal, no, it was something much more deliberate. It was as if the forest itself was trying to communicate with us, but in a way we couldn't understand. We stopped dead in our tracks when the first real sign of something truly wrong appeared. A series of symbols carved into the trunks of the trees. At first, I thought it might be some sort of marking left by hikers, but as we examined them more closely, I realized they were too precise, too intentional. These weren't random scratches from a knife or tools. The symbols seemed to pulse with an eerie energy. There was no explanation for how or why they were there, but the sight of them sent a deep shiver down my spine. "Do you see that?" one of my friends whispered, pointing toward the symbols. I nodded, my heart racing. "Yeah, but what are they? Who would do something like that?" I didn't want to think about it. I didn't want to give it life. But the symbols seemed to draw us in, pulling our attention to them in ways I couldn't explain. I felt like I needed to understand what they meant, but at the same time, I was terrified to find out. We pressed on, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease, but the further we went, the more the forest seemed to change. The air grew thick, as if it were filled with something heavy and unseen. The trees leaned in closer, their branches tangling together, blocking out more and more of the light. We hadn't seen another person for hours, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And then it happened again. A noise. But this time, it was louder, closer. A low, rumbling growl echoed from deep within the trees, cutting through the thick silence. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't something natural. The sound reverberated through my chest, and I felt a knot of fear twist in my stomach. My friends were frozen, staring into the darkness ahead, their eyes wide with the same terror that gripped me. "Did you hear that?" one of them finally asked, his voice barely a whisper. I nodded, my throat dry. "Yeah, but what was it?" We all stood in silence, trying to make sense of the noise. It was gone now, but the tension hung in the air, thick and oppressive. There was something out there, something that wasn't supposed to be. I could feel it. We all could. The feeling of being watched was growing stronger. It wasn't just in the back of my mind anymore. It was like a presence, lingering just beyond the reach of our vision. The trees swayed slightly, though there was no wind to move them. The air was thick, almost as if it had been saturated with something darker, something that made it hard to breathe. We pushed on, though none of us spoke. We didn't need to. We were all thinking the same thing. We were in over our heads. The path was no longer a path. It was a maze, twisting and turning in impossible directions. Each time we thought we saw a way out, the trees would shift, blocking our way. I could hear the sounds again, louder now. The strange rustling, the snap of a branch underfoot. There was something or someone moving just out of sight. It was then that we found the clearing. At first, I thought it was a sign of relief, a place to stop, catch our breath, and get our bearings. But as we stepped into the open space, something felt wrong. The air was colder here, and the ground beneath our feet felt soft, almost spongy. The once crisp grass now appeared wilted, as if it had been trampled by something far heavier than we were. There were more symbols here, too. On the rocks, the trees, the ground itself. They were etched into the earth, almost as if they were meant to guide us, but to where? We were standing in the center of the clearing now, and it felt like the forest had closed in around us. These symbols, they're everywhere, my friend muttered, running his fingers over one of the carvings. He looked up, his face pale. What the hell is this? I didn't have an answer. I didn't want to have an answer. But deep down, I knew we were no longer just lost. We were being led somewhere. Somewhere that didn't belong to the world we knew. The air shifted again, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was no sound now. No birds. No animals. It was like the entire forest had gone silent. All I could hear was the distant rustle of the trees and my own breathing, shallow and uneven. Then, something moved. A shadow. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a person. It was something far darker, far more ancient. The shadow passed between the trees, its shape flickering in and out of view. I couldn't see it clearly, but I felt it move around us, watching us. Its presence was suffocating, and I could feel it crawling under my skin. My friends must have seen it too, because we all froze, our eyes wide with fear. We didn't speak, didn't move. We just stood there, our hearts pounding in our chests. And then, in the blink of an eye, it was gone. But the forest hadn't gone back to normal. It had shifted again, becoming darker, more oppressive. It felt as though we were trapped in a place that didn't belong to time or space. The trees no longer felt like trees. The air no longer felt like air. And the path ahead was no longer a path. It was a maze of symbols, whispers, and shadows that we couldn't escape from. I knew we had to keep moving, but every step felt heavier than the last. We were no longer just walking through the woods. We were being drawn into something much older, much darker. By now, we had lost all sense of time. It felt like we had been walking through the forest for days, though I knew it hadn't been that long. The path was a nightmare, twisting and turning as though it were alive, designed to lead us deeper into the dark heart of the woods. Every step felt heavier, and the oppressive atmosphere only grew more intense with each passing moment. I could feel it now, something closing in on us. The presence we had sensed earlier, the one lurking in the shadows, was drawing near. It wasn't just the trees creaking or the wind howling through the branches. It was something much more tangible. Something that was watching us. Then, out of nowhere, we saw it a clearing, but not like the one before. This one felt wrong from the moment we stepped into it. The air was colder, and the ground beneath our feet was soft and spongy, as though it were alive. The trees that surrounded the clearing had twisted trunks, and their leaves seemed to shimmer unnaturally in the dim light. It wasn't the place that bothered me. It was what was at the center of it, a stone altar, half covered in vines, with symbols carved into it. The air around the altar seemed to pulse, and the shadows around it flickered, as if the darkness itself was alive. I froze in place, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure what I was looking at, but I knew one thing for sure. We weren't supposed to be here. And whatever this thing was, it didn't want us here either. My friends, too, had come to a standstill. No one said a word. The silence was unbearable, broken only by the sound of our shallow breaths. "What is this?" one of them whispered, his voice barely audible. I didn't answer. I couldn't. The answer was right in front of me, but I wasn't ready to acknowledge it. It felt like the world around us had tilted, and we had stepped into something far darker than we could ever imagine. The altar seemed to draw us in, beckoning us with an irresistible force. Without thinking, I took a step forward. It wasn't conscious. It was like I had no control over my own body. Something was pulling me toward the altar, a force I couldn't explain, and the others my friends followed. It was as if the very ground was swallowing us whole, pushing us toward the center of this twisted place. When we reached the altar, the air grew even colder. The darkness seemed to seep from the stone, and the symbols etched into it seemed to pulse, glowing faintly with an unnatural light. I reached out, trembling, my hand hovering over the surface of the altar. My fingers brushed against the cold stone, and in that instant, the ground trembled beneath our feet. We stumbled back, gasping, as a low, guttural sound rumbled from deep within the earth. It wasn't just a noise, it was a vibration, one that seemed to shake the very core of the forest. The trees began to twist, their branches reaching toward us, almost as if they were alive. And then it happened. The ground beneath us cracked open, splitting wide as though something ancient and powerful was rising from the depths. A force beyond comprehension surged upward, and the air seemed to thicken with an otherworldly presence. The darkness that had once been just a shadow now seemed to come alive, swirling around us in a dense, suffocating fog. I turned to my friends, but they weren't there anymore. They were gone, vanished into the darkness. Panic surged through me as I called out to them, but my voice was swallowed by the void. I couldn't see them. I couldn't hear them. It was as if the world itself had consumed them. The ground shook again, and the altar began to crack open, revealing something beneath it. A pair of glowing eyes appeared from the depths, staring up at me with a malevolent intelligence. They were not human eyes. They weren't even animal eyes. They were something ancient, something that had been waiting here for far longer than any of us had existed. And then it spoke, not in words, but in thoughts, in feelings. The voice echoed in my mind, chilling me to the bone. You should not have come here. The voice was ancient, full of anger, and yet it was sad, as though it had been waiting for this moment for centuries. I could feel the weight of its gaze on me, its presence pressing down on my chest. I tried to move, to run, but my feet felt rooted to the spot. The darkness seemed to be pulling me in, inch by inch, suffocating me, smothering me in its cold grip. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. All I could feel was the overwhelming presence of the creature that now stood before me, its eyes burning into my soul. In the distance, I could hear my friends' screams, distant, distorted, as though they were trapped somewhere far away. But it wasn't real. It was just the creature, playing with my mind, twisting my perceptions of reality. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped my mouth. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't obey me. The creature's gaze was too powerful, too all-consuming. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the presence lifted. The air cleared, the trees stopped twisting, and the ground beneath me stopped shaking. I blinked, trying to process what had just happened. The altar was gone, replaced by a small pile of stones. My friends were back, standing beside me, their faces pale and wide-eyed. What the hell just happened? One of them whispered, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. I couldn't explain it. I didn't even know what had just happened. The creature had vanished, leaving nothing behind but the suffocating silence of the forest. But the fear was still there, lingering in my chest, gnawing at my thoughts. The silence that followed the strange encounter was suffocating. My body was trembling, as if it couldn't shake the lingering sensation of something unseen pressing down on me. The forest, once eerily alive with whispers and rustlings, was now unnervingly still. I could hear nothing but the thudding of my own heartbeat, drowning out the eerie quiet that surrounded us. We stood there for what felt like hours, unsure of what to do, unsure of what had just happened. The last remnants of the creature's presence seemed to hang in the air like smoke, an invisible weight that I couldn't shake off. I turned to my friends, who were now just as shaken as I was. Their eyes were wide with fear, and their faces were pale. The terror we had experienced was written all over them. It was clear that none of us had any real understanding of what we had just encountered. What were those glowing eyes? What was that presence? We had come so close to something ancient, something beyond our comprehension, and I wasn't sure if any of us would ever truly be the same. We need to leave, I said, my voice sounding foreign to me, hoarse, trembling, as though it didn't belong to me. None of us argued. We all knew that this place had claimed enough of us. We couldn't risk staying any longer. The forest no longer felt like a place of solitude or peace. It had become something else entirely, a place of dark, ancient power, a place where we were not welcome. It had watched us. It had waited for us. And now it was done with us. We didn't speak as we made our way back down the path, our footsteps quick and desperate. Every crack of a twig underfoot, every rustle of the wind through the trees made us jump. It was as though we were being followed, as though something was still out there, watching us, waiting for us to falter. The path seemed longer than I remembered. The trees seemed to close in around us, their twisted branches stretching out, as if trying to pull us back into the depths of the forest. I could feel my pulse quicken with each step. I wanted to run, but I couldn't, not yet. Not until I knew we were out of that cursed place. We came to the edge of the forest, the familiar sight of the open field ahead of us. But something wasn't right. It was too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects were missing, and even the wind seemed to have stopped. There was no breeze, no rustle of leaves. The air felt thick, heavy, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I looked back at the forest, my heart in my throat. It was hard to believe what had just happened. The altar, the creature, the way everything seemed to bend and twist as though it were a dream. But the feeling in my chest told me it was no dream. We had just crossed some kind of boundary, some line we shouldn't have crossed. And now we were paying the price. We continued forward, but every step felt wrong. It was as if the forest was still reaching for us, trying to pull us back into its darkness. I could almost feel its fingers closing around my ankles, tugging at my very soul. I wanted to say something, anything, to break the suffocating silence, but I couldn't. No words seemed right. How could we explain what had happened? How could we tell anyone what we had seen, what we had experienced? They wouldn't believe us. They couldn't. Finally, we reached the edge of the forest, the line where the trees gave way to open fields. The relief I felt was immense, but it was tempered by something else, something dark, something that I couldn't shake off. It was as though the forest had given us a final warning, a reminder that it wasn't done with us. We didn't stop to look back. We didn't stop to take a breath. We just kept walking, further and further from that cursed place, until the last trees faded behind us, and the forest was nothing but a distant shadow on the horizon. But even as we left it behind, I could feel it lingering in the back of my mind. I haven't gone back to those woods. In fact, I've avoided the area entirely, even years later. And yet, every time I close my eyes, I still see those eyes, those glowing eyes, piercing the darkness, watching me, haunting me. It's been a long time now, but I still find myself waking up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, the memory of that moment fresh in my mind. The world has moved on, and life has carried on as it always does, but that night in the forest, it changed something in me, something deep down, something I can't quite explain. We never spoke about it again, not in detail. The others and I, we've all moved on with our lives, trying to pretend like it didn't happen. But in the silence of the night, when I'm alone with my thoughts, it always comes back to me. The questions, the fear, the sense that the forest still remembers us, that it's still out there, waiting. I've tried to tell myself that it was just a bad experience, that the terror was just a product of our imaginations running wild in an unfamiliar and unsettling place. But deep down, I know better. We encountered something out there, something ancient, something powerful. And whatever it was, it didn't want us there. It made that perfectly clear. I wonder sometimes if the others still think about it as much as I do, if they ever feel that same lingering sense of dread. We all agreed never to speak about it, but I can't help but wonder if we've all kept the secret locked inside, each of us carrying that same dark weight. Perhaps it's the kind of thing that changes a person, something you can never truly escape. Sometimes, when I find myself near that stretch of woods, I'll glance toward it, as if some part of me expects to see it again, the shape of that creature, or those glowing eyes staring back at me. waiting for the right moment to make its return. I tell myself it's just fear, just memories playing tricks on me, but there's always that nagging feeling, that sense that something is out there, that it's watching. I wonder too if we ever really left. That night, we thought we had escaped, that we were beyond the reach of whatever dark force haunted those woods. But now, I can't help but think, maybe the forest didn't just let us go. Maybe it made sure we would remember, made sure we would never forget. Perhaps it was never about getting away. Maybe it was about the forest marking us, claiming us in a way that can't be undone. Maybe we were never meant to escape it entirely. Maybe it's always been there, just waiting for us to come back, to finish whatever it started. And so, I live with that fear, with that lingering thought that the forest hasn't forgotten us, that it's waiting for us to return, for us to make that final, fateful step back into its depths. It might be years before it calls to us again, or maybe it's already waiting for the perfect moment when we least expect it. It was the kind of trip that seemed innocent enough at first. My friends and I were looking for a weekend getaway to break the monotony of our regular lives. The city was just a few hours away, and we thought it would be the perfect escape. A weekend in a quaint hotel seemed like just the thing. We booked a room at a charming, old-fashioned hotel that we had read good things about online. It wasn't the fanciest place, but there was something about it, something that made it feel like it had character, a certain type of old-world charm. I was with two other people, Ben, a longtime friend, and Mia, someone I had met through Ben a few months earlier. We all had different expectations for the weekend, but none of us ever thought we would encounter anything out of the ordinary. Ben was the kind of guy who always had a sarcastic remark at the ready and wasn't one to take anything seriously. Mia, on the other hand, was more laid back. She liked to travel and explore new places, but she wasn't into anything spooky or paranormal. As for me, I was just along for the ride, thinking it would be a relaxing time. We arrived at the hotel in the late afternoon, the sun still hanging low in the sky. The place was nestled in a small town, surrounded by old trees and cobblestone streets. The building itself was massive, with old brick walls and a large front porch. It looked like a place that had been there for generations, weathered by time, but still standing strong. We were greeted by the receptionist, a woman who seemed to have a welcoming yet distant aura. She smiled politely as she handed over our keys and told us our room number. It was the last room at the end of a long, narrow hallway on the third floor. She mentioned that the hotel had been around for a long time, and that it had seen its fair share of visitors, some of whom had stayed in that very room. But she said it all with such a casual tone that it didn't seem out of the ordinary at all. Just part of the routine. The room was what you would expect from a hotel of its age: antique furniture, heavy curtains, and a large four-poster bed. The air had a slight musty scent, but nothing too overwhelming. It felt like stepping back in time. The room was cozy, with just enough space to feel comfortable, but not too much to make it feel vast and empty. We all agreed that it was just right for a weekend away. No signs of anything unusual, just a simple hotel room. We didn't waste any time. After unpacking and settling in, we headed out to explore the town. We spent the evening strolling through the streets, grabbing a bite to eat at a local diner, and enjoying the peaceful atmosphere of the place. The town seemed almost frozen in time, untouched by the usual chaos of modern life. The people were friendly, the air was crisp, and everything felt right. Later that night, we returned to the hotel, tired but content. We shared a few laughs in the lobby, and then we made our way back to our room. The hallway was quiet, and the only sounds were the soft footsteps echoing off the old wooden floors. The receptionist was nowhere to be seen, but the lobby lights still glowed softly, casting long shadows on the walls. As we entered the room, the warmth from the day seemed to vanish, replaced by an odd stillness. The room felt colder, despite the heater running, and for a moment, none of us said anything. Ben, always the joker, made a comment about the temperature change, but even he seemed a bit off. Mia turned on the TV to break the silence, and I busied myself with getting ready for bed. We had an early morning ahead of us, but something wasn't quite right. It was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. A faint creak of the floorboards, as though someone or something was walking through the room. I brushed it off, thinking it was just the old building settling. After all, this hotel had been here for years, right? But then, as I sat on the edge of the bed, I noticed a shadow near the corner of the room. It flickered for just a second before disappearing, almost as if it had never been there at all. I looked over at Mia and Ben, but they hadn't noticed anything. Ben was still fiddling with his phone, and Mia was engrossed in whatever was on the screen. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, it had been a long day, and I was probably just tired. But the shadow, it lingered in my mind. It was something so small, so easy to miss, that at first we chalked it up to our imaginations or the quirks of an old building. But over time, the strangeness began to build, layer by layer, until it became impossible to ignore. It was around midnight when we first noticed it. Mia had already turned off the TV and was getting ready for bed, pulling the heavy curtains closed to block out the dim streetlights outside. Ben, as usual, was being a little difficult. He was reluctant to sleep, so he started pacing around the room, looking at the old paintings on the walls. As he did, I noticed something that I had missed earlier, a large, ornate mirror on the opposite side of the room, next to the window. I hadn't given it much thought before. It was a typical hotel mirror, big, framed in dark wood, with intricate carvings. The kind of piece you'd find in any establishment that tried to evoke a sense of old-world elegance. But now, as I stood by the bed, I couldn't help but feel something was off about it. It was reflecting the room, of course, but it felt different, almost like it was distorting the reality in some way. The room appeared slightly darker in the reflection than in reality, and the edges of the mirror seemed to shimmer, like the glass wasn't quite clear. I dismissed it quickly, telling myself I was just being tired, seeing things that weren't there. But when I looked back, the distortion was still there, only now it seemed even more pronounced. The reflections of the furniture, the bed, and the window, all of it seemed to waver. Not much, just enough to make the scene feel off balance. I glanced over at Ben to see if he noticed anything, but he was too busy examining the wall behind the mirror, his face pressed up close to it, inspecting the woodwork. He was always the curious one, digging into details no one else cared about. Mia, meanwhile, had already gotten into bed, her head resting on the pillow, clearly tired. "Ben, what's up with the mirror?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. afraid that the odd feeling it gave me might spread to others. Ben turned away from the mirror and shrugged. I don't know. It's just a mirror. But there's something strange about the wood around it. It's not like the rest of the furniture in here. See, he pointed at the edges of the frame. This looks newer, like they replaced part of it. I squinted at the mirror, trying to make sense of what he was pointing out. He was right about one thing. There was a section of the frame that didn't match the rest of the woodwork. The color was slightly off, a bit lighter than the surrounding pieces. But beyond that, nothing seemed to jump out. I didn't say anything else. It was just a mirror after all. And yet, the sense of unease that had settled in the pit of my stomach was growing. Mia, already turning over in bed, groaned. Can we please just get some sleep? It's been a long day. Her voice was muffled by the pillow, and for a moment I thought she might be annoyed by our weirdness. But Ben, ever the skeptic, shot back a laugh. Yeah, we'll be fine. Nothing's wrong with the mirror, trust me, he said, as though trying to reassure himself as much as us. We turned off the lights and climbed into bed. The room fell silent except for the hum of the heater, which, despite the cold, was still working to keep the place warm. I closed my eyes, trying to shake the feeling of discomfort. Ben's voice drifted over from the other side of the room as he muttered something about the furniture being too fancy and how it made him feel like he was in a museum. Mia, on the other hand, had already started to snore lightly, and I could hear her slow, steady breathing. But just as I thought sleep might come, I heard it a sound. Soft at first, barely perceptible, but there nonetheless. It was a rhythmic tapping, like someone was knocking on the door, or more accurately, tapping gently on the wooden floor. I froze, listening closely. It wasn't coming from the door, though. It was coming from somewhere inside the room. I wasn't sure what to think. The tapping continued for a few seconds, then stopped. I glanced at Ben, who was still awake, staring up at the ceiling. His eyes met mine in the darkness, and I knew he had heard it too. What was that? I whispered, feeling my throat tighten. Ben didn't reply right away. He seemed to be considering the sound, as though trying to rationalize it. It's probably just the building settling. Old wood creaks, especially with the heat running. Nothing to freak out about, he finally said, but his tone wasn't as confident as usual. The tapping stopped for a moment, only to resume, this time a little louder. It wasn't rhythmic anymore, but a quick, uneven series of taps, almost frantic. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, and looked toward the source of the sound. My eyes were drawn back to the mirror, where the reflection of the room seemed to be. Off. Again, the shapes in the reflection didn't match up with what I was seeing in real life. The furniture in the reflection appeared to be farther away than it actually was, and there was a faint, swirling mist near the edge of the mirror. I jumped out of bed, my legs shaky beneath me. Ben, something's wrong with that mirror. I'm serious, I said, my voice shaking now. Ben, ever the skeptic, slowly got up from his bed and walked toward the mirror. You're being paranoid, he said, though I could tell he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. I stayed a few paces behind him, my eyes locked on the mirror. When Ben reached the mirror and reached out to touch it, I almost expected him to stop. But he didn't. His hand grazed the surface of the glass, and for a moment, the mist inside the reflection swirled in response to his touch. I saw it with my own eyes, like the glass itself was alive, shifting in response to our movements. Ben stepped back immediately, his face paling. Okay, that wasn't right. I didn't know what to say. I was paralyzed, my gaze still fixed on the mirror. But it wasn't just the mirror anymore. It was the entire room. The air had thickened, like something heavy was pressing down on us, making it hard to breathe. Mia stirred in her bed, groaning again, clearly annoyed by the disruption. But she didn't wake up completely. What's going on? Can't we sleep? She mumbled. Ben and I exchanged a look, both of us feeling the same growing sense of dread. Neither of us said anything for a long moment. The mirror was quiet again. The tapping had stopped, but the silence in the room was thick, too thick, like the calm before a storm. The next morning, after an uneasy night of restless sleep, none of us spoke about the mirror or the tapping. It seemed like we had all tried to push the strange events out of our minds, blaming them on our tiredness, the unfamiliar setting, or just a product of overactive imaginations. We went through our morning routine quietly, as though nothing unusual had happened. Ben was the first to try to shake it off. He made a joke about how we were all overreacting and how he'd never been so jumpy in his life. But the truth was, the mirror had left an impression on all of us. The reflection that didn't quite match the room, the mist inside the glass, the eerie tapping, it didn't sit right. And every time I glanced at the mirror, I couldn't help but feel that it was watching us. It wasn't long before we began to notice the subtle signs that something was far from normal in that hotel room. At first, they were easy to dismiss, but as they began to increase in frequency, the weight of the unease started to bear down on us. It began with the lights. The overhead lights in the room flickered sporadically, but it wasn't like the kind of flickering you'd get from a bad bulb or faulty wiring. No, this felt intentional. The lights would dim slowly, almost deliberately, then brighten again, as if something or someone was playing with them. And it wasn't just the lights in the main room. Even the bedside lamps, which had been perfectly functional the night before, started to act up. They would glow brightly for a few seconds, then suddenly turn off altogether, only to come back on after a few moments. Mia was the first to comment on it. She was brushing her hair in the bathroom when the light above her flickered on and off, casting strange shadows across her face in the mirror. "Ugh, not again," she muttered, turning the light off manually. "These lights are driving me crazy." I tried to laugh it off. Must be some bad wiring. It's an old hotel after all. But the flickering was starting to get to me. Every time the lights flickered, the room seemed to feel colder, the air heavier, as though something was shifting around us, just beyond our reach. But the lights weren't the only issue. Over the course of the next few hours, we all began to hear the tapping again. It wasn't as loud or as frantic as the previous night, but it was there, just faint enough to be dismissed, just persistent enough to keep us on edge. It was a rhythmic tapping, now coming from the walls, then from the floor, sometimes near the corner of the room, sometimes by the window. Each time it seemed to shift position, as if it were following us. I'd been sitting on the bed, flipping through a book I hadn't really been reading, when I heard the faint tapping again. It was coming from the wall near the window. Slowly, I put the book down and got up, walking toward the sound. Ben was already standing by the wall, his head cocked to one side, as though trying to listen for something that I couldn't hear. "Do you hear that?" I asked quietly, almost afraid that if I said it too loud, the sound would stop. Ben nodded without looking at me. "Yeah, it's coming from the wall. It's like someone's tapping from the other side. It's strange." He reached out and pressed his palm flat against the cold surface of the wall, but the sound stopped immediately. I stood there, staring at the spot where the tapping had been, my heart thumping in my chest. There was no explanation for it. We were on the second floor of the building. There was nothing on the other side of that wall, no one who could have been tapping. And yet, I could feel that same heavy, oppressive air around me. The kind that always lingered just before something terrible happened. We both turned to Mia, who had been sitting at the desk, trying to distract herself by scrolling through her phone. Her eyes were wide, and she looked back at us, her face pale. "What is going on with this place?" she whispered. The tension in the room was palpable. It wasn't just the lights, or the tapping, or the strange reflections in the mirror anymore. It was everything, the way the air felt too thick, the way time seemed to bend and stretch in that room. We were no longer in control of the situation, and it felt like we were being toyed with, pushed to the edge of something we couldn't understand. That evening, we decided to take matters into our own hands. We couldn't keep pretending everything was fine when there was something clearly wrong in that room. We needed to figure out what was happening, to understand why we were all feeling so unsettled. We started by examining the mirror more closely, hoping to find some logical explanation for the odd distortion we had seen the night before. Ben tried to reason that maybe the glass was simply old and warped, But none of us could ignore the way the room had looked inside it, darker, almost like a shadowed version of reality. I stood in front of the mirror, staring into the reflection. It was exactly the same as it had been the night before. The furniture was slightly off, the room darker, and the edges of the mirror still rippling as though the glass itself was moving. I reached out, my fingers brushing the cool surface of the mirror. It felt solid, unyielding, but the moment my fingers touched it, the room seemed to shift again. The air grew colder, and the faint tapping from the walls began again, louder this time. I pulled my hand back quickly, my heart racing. Ben was already standing behind me, his face pale. "What the hell was that?" "I don't know," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But it's like it's reacting to us." We both turned to Mia, who had been standing in the doorway, watching us silently. "What's going on?" she asked. "Why is everything so weird all of a sudden?" I didn't know how to answer her. There were no words for what we were experiencing. The room was becoming more oppressive with every passing moment. The strange events, now constant and frequent, had escalated to the point where it felt like something was closing in on us, forcing us to confront whatever darkness lingered within the hotel. That night, as we tried to sleep, the sounds grew worse. The tapping was relentless, echoing throughout the room, and this time it was joined by other noises. The creaking of floorboards, as if someone was walking across the room. The rustling of sheets, as though someone was shifting in bed, except no one was moving. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, the noises grew louder. The air grew thicker, and I could feel that cold, creeping sensation that something was waiting for us, just out of sight, just beyond our reach. In the dead of night, I heard something else, something that made my blood run cold. It was a low, guttural whisper, just beyond the edge of hearing, as if someone was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I shot up in bed, my heart pounding. The room was dark, the shadows pressing in from every corner. The tapping had stopped, but now there was something worse, something unseen, but felt. I turned to Ben and Mia, who were both awake, their eyes wide with fear. But neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. We all knew that whatever had started in that hotel room was only just beginning. And the more we tried to fight it, the more it seemed to push back, drawing us into a web of terror that we couldn't escape. The night grew colder, the darkness settling like a heavy blanket over the room. The oppressive air in the hotel seemed to stretch into every corner, every inch of space, leaving no escape from the unease that had taken root in our minds. It was as if the very walls were closing in on us, trapping us in a web of terror we couldn't break free from. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle of the sheets, only served to heighten the sense of impending doom that loomed over us. The tapping had stopped, but the whispering continued. It was faint at first, like a low murmur just beneath the threshold of hearing, but as the minutes stretched into hours, it became more distinct, more demanding. I could no longer ignore it. The sound was growing louder, more insistent, as if something was beckoning us, urging us to listen. I was the first to crack. I couldn't stand it anymore, the silence between us growing unbearable. "What is happening?" I asked, my voice a mere whisper in the suffocating darkness. Mia, who had been sitting on the edge of the bed, her face pale and drawn, stared at me for a long moment before speaking. "I don't know, but I feel like something's coming. Something's waiting." The room seemed to grow even colder at her words, and I could see the fear reflected in her eyes. Fear that mirrored my own. Ben was sitting on the floor, his head buried in his hands, as though he couldn't bear to face what was happening. We had been through this all before: strange lights, unexplained sounds, the feeling of being watched, but now it felt different. It was as though the room itself had turned against us, and we were powerless to stop it. The whispers became louder, no longer a faint murmur, but a harsh, guttural voice that seemed to echo from all sides. It was indecipherable, the words foreign and alien, but the tone was unmistakable. It was malicious, angry. It was as if the very air in the room was charged with the weight of 1,000 unspeakable horrors. Then, all at once, the lights went out. The room plunged into darkness. I could hear Ben's frantic breathing, his gasps for air as he scrambled to turn on his flashlight. Mia let out a small scream, her voice trembling with panic as she fumbled for her phone. My heart pounded in my chest, the blood rushing in my ears as I stared into the void of the room. And that's when I saw it. A shadow. At first, it was just a flicker, a brief movement in the corner of my eye. But when I turned to look, it was gone. But I knew it hadn't been a trick of the light. Something was there. Something had moved. I stepped back instinctively, but before I could say anything, the whispering intensified, now loud enough to make my head throb with the pressure. The walls seemed to pulse, the air growing thick with an oppressive force that threatened to crush us under its weight. I could feel the room closing in on me, the darkness swallowing us whole. "Ben, Mia," I shouted, my voice breaking. "We need to get out of here." But it was too late. The shadow returned, this time solid, taking shape before my eyes. It wasn't a person, not in the way we understand people. It was something else, something twisted, its form shifting and changing, its features distorted and unnatural. It moved toward us, and I could feel its presence pressing against me, suffocating me. My heart raced, and for a moment, I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The air in the room felt thick with the weight of its gaze, like it was studying us, waiting for the right moment to strike. Then, without warning, it lunged. I didn't have time to react. The force of the shadow's movement knocked me back, and I crashed to the floor, gasping for air. Mia screamed, and I could hear her scrambling away, her footsteps frantic as she tried to escape. Ben was shouting, his voice filled with terror, but the words were lost in the chaos. The room was alive with movement now. The shadows seemed to twist and stretch, reaching out to grab us, pulling us into the darkness. The whispers were deafening, echoing in my skull, drowning out everything else. I could feel my pulse hammering in my chest, the fear consuming me, and I knew, with sickening certainty, that whatever this was, it was not going to let us leave. And then, in a flash of blinding light, everything stopped. The shadows vanished. The whispers ceased. The room was still. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling uncontrollably. I couldn't understand what had just happened. Had we imagined it? Had we all just lost our minds? Ben was the first to speak, his voice hoarse with fear. What the hell was that? I didn't have an answer. I couldn't even begin to process what we had just experienced. The room was silent now, unnervingly so, as though nothing had happened. But we knew better. We knew something dark had been unleashed in that room. Something that had been waiting for us. Something that would never let us forget what had happened. The room was still, almost unnaturally so. The sudden absence of the shadows and the silence in the air left us suspended in a haze of disbelief, unsure of what had just transpired. It was as though the world had paused, waiting for us to make a decision, waiting for us to act. I couldn't move. My body was numb from the fear, my limbs frozen in place as I stared at the dark corner of the room, half expecting the shadows to return, to drag us back into the nightmare we had just experienced. Mia sat huddled on the bed, her eyes wide with terror, while Ben stood by the door, his hand gripping the handle as if he were ready to bolt at a moment's notice. We didn't speak at first. None of us knew what to say. Words felt too fragile, too insignificant to describe what had happened, what we had witnessed. There was no explanation for it, no rational answer that could make sense of the twisted nightmare we had just lived through. It didn't matter that the whispers had stopped or that the shadows had disappeared. We all knew, deep down, that whatever it was, whatever force had tried to claim us, it hadn't left. It was still there, waiting. What do we do now? Ben's voice broke the silence, shaky and uncertain. He was still staring at the door, his eyes flicking nervously to the corner of the room where the shadows had first emerged. "We leave," I said, my voice hoarse from the adrenaline. "We leave now." Mia nodded, her face pale, her lips trembling as she grabbed her bag and stood up. She didn't need any further convincing. None of us did. We all knew that we couldn't stay in that room another minute, not after what had happened. The air felt thick with an invisible weight, pressing in from all sides, and every creak of the floorboards seemed to echo with the memory of the terror that had just unfolded. But as we moved toward the door, I hesitated. For just a moment, I glanced back at the room, at the place where the nightmare had begun. The bed, the walls, the corner where the shadows had lurked, it all seemed so ordinary, as if nothing had ever happened, as if we were the ones who had imagined the whole thing. I felt a chill run down my spine as I closed the door behind us, locking it with a finality that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. But the strange thing was, as we stepped into the hallway, we didn't feel the relief we'd expected. There was no sense of escape, no sense of safety. The hotel was silent, too silent, and the further we walked away from that room, the more the weight of what had just happened settled over us. We reached the elevator, but when the doors opened, a sense of unease washed over me. The hallway was too still, too quiet. There were no sounds, no signs of life. I glanced at Mia and Ben, both of them as uneasy as I was. But we didn't talk. We just stepped into the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator's descent felt interminable. Each floor it passed seemed to drag us deeper into the unknown, into something we couldn't fully comprehend. When the doors finally opened, we stepped into the lobby, but it was just as empty as the rest of the hotel. The receptionist's desk was unattended, the lights dim, and there wasn't a single soul in sight. We exchanged glances, the unease growing with each passing second. Ben was the first to break the silence. "We need to leave. Right now." We didn't hesitate. We rushed toward the exit, not looking back, not even daring to glance at the walls or the floors or the windows. We just needed to get out of there. The night air outside felt like a lifeline, the cool breeze against our skin a brief, fleeting comfort after the suffocating atmosphere inside. As we stood on the sidewalk, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. We hadn't solved anything. We hadn't discovered why the room was haunted, why it had tormented us. The answers we sought were still out of reach. And yet, in that moment, I realized something. The hotel was more than just a building. It was a place where something malevolent had taken root, something that had watched us, studied us, and tried to drag us into its darkness. It was a place where we had become part of a story that would never be fully explained. And as we stood there, staring at the hotel's facade, I knew that we could never return. No matter how much time passed, the memory of that room would haunt us. We didn't speak as we made our way to the car. We didn't need to. We all knew that we had just survived something unexplainable, something that would never be fully understood. The car's engine roared to life as we drove away, but even as we left the hotel behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed us. That something had been waiting for us to leave so it could continue its watch over the abandoned halls of that cursed place. We never spoke of the hotel again. There was no need. The weeks passed, and the memories of that night seemed to blur into the backdrop of my life. At least, that's what I tried to tell myself. Life moved on in its usual, predictable rhythm. I went to work, hung out with friends, did everything I had to do to keep moving forward, to not let the haunting experience swallow me whole. But deep down, I could feel it, the presence, the unease, the knowledge that what we had encountered at the hotel was not something you simply forget. In moments of silence, when I was alone with my thoughts, I'd find myself thinking about that room. I'd replay the images of the shadows, the eerie quiet that followed, and the strange, crawling dread that filled every corner. There was a part of me, a part I couldn't explain, that wanted to believe it had all been a trick of the mind, a bad dream, a moment of shared hysteria. But another part, the stronger part, knew better. That thing, that presence, wasn't just in our heads. It was real, and for reasons I couldn't fathom, it had chosen us. I never saw Mia or Ben again after we left the hotel. We all went our separate ways, never discussing what had happened, as though acknowledging it aloud would somehow make it more real. Perhaps we were all too terrified to revisit that dark place in our minds. Or maybe we simply didn't know how to make sense of it. But one evening, months after the incident, I received a message. It was from Mia, just a few short words that sent a cold shiver down my spine. The hotel is still standing. My heart skipped a beat as I read those words over and over. She hadn't forgotten, nor had I. The hotel still existed, and something about that fact made everything we had experienced feel unfinished, as if the final chapter of our story had been written but had yet to be closed. I tried to reach out to her, but there was no response. Days passed, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something had happened. Something that tied us back to the hotel, even though we tried to leave it behind. Maybe it was my mind playing tricks on me, but I couldn't ignore the instinct that told me something wasn't right. A month later, I found myself back in the town where the hotel stood. I didn't know why I was there or what drew me back. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was the lingering questions that still haunted me. But there I was, standing in front of the same hotel, the one with the cracked windows, the dilapidated exterior, and the weight of something ancient pressing down on it. It looked almost abandoned, but I could still feel the oppressive presence in the air. It was the same, and yet it was different. It felt alive. I didn't go inside. I couldn't bring myself to. I just stood there, staring at the building, waiting for something to happen. A few moments passed in silence, and then, almost as if on cue, the front door creaked open. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall, cloaked, and unmistakably familiar. It was the receptionist from that night, the one who had smiled at us so politely, offering us the room without question. The one whose eyes had seemed too calm, too distant. She walked toward me, her pace slow, deliberate. I stood frozen, my body refusing to move as she reached out, offering a smile that felt more like a warning than a greeting. "You came back," she said softly, her voice eerily calm. My heart raced. "Why? Why is it still standing?" I asked, barely able to speak. She chuckled, a low, unsettling sound. "Some places are meant to stay. They never leave, and neither do the people they touch." The words sent a chill through me, and before I could respond, she was gone, disappearing into the shadows of the hotel once again. I stood there in complete silence, trying to process what had just happened. Had it all been real? Was it possible that the hotel itself was alive in some way? Could it really be waiting for us? I never saw Mia or Ben again. In fact, I never heard from them after that brief message. It's as if they had disappeared, swallowed by the same darkness we had tried to escape. I still don't know what happened to them, or why the hotel was so determined to keep us there. But I do know one thing: something about that place never let go. And I don't think it ever will. As I left the town, the image of the hotel stayed with me. It loomed in my mind like an unspoken truth, a memory that would never fade. I couldn't escape it, and I didn't know if I wanted to. The experience had changed me in ways I couldn't fully understand. It had shown me that some things exist beyond the limits of logic, beyond what the eye can see or the mind can grasp. Some things remain in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make their presence known. So, the hotel stands, still there, as it always has been. And maybe, just maybe, it's still waiting for someone else to check in, for someone else to discover its secrets. The kind of weather where the chill in the air seems to seep into your bones, and the early evening darkens the world far too quickly. The wind would gust between the trees, and the leaves would crunch underfoot, telling a quiet story of their own. I had always found solace in nature. The slow pace of walking through forests, feeling the earth beneath my shoes, and letting my mind wander. It was like a reset button, one that helped me recover from the chaos of daily life. I wasn't alone on this particular day, though. I had a friend, a colleague from work, who was just as keen on the outdoors. We'd met only a few months ago, when we both signed up for a weekend getaway organized by our office. We quickly clicked and shared a common bond in our love for hiking and exploring new places. The kind of friendship that didn't need much to flourish, just good company and some quiet time in nature. That evening, we decided to take a walk through the woods. There was a small trail that ran through a thick, quiet forest not far from where we lived. It was a place we'd both visited a few times, a sort of refuge away from the daily grind. The kind of place where, if you weren't careful, you could lose yourself in the isolation of the trees. I think we were both ready to embrace that feeling of solitude after all. The world outside had been stressful enough lately. A walk in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. We weren't expecting anything out of the ordinary. There was no grand adventure on the horizon, no looming danger to warn us off. It was just a walk. But sometimes, the things we least expect have a way of sneaking up on us. As we set off down the trail, the evening light started to fade, and the cool air of dusk settled in. The forest, with its thick canopy of trees, seemed to absorb the sunlight, making everything feel darker, even though it was still early in the evening. The soft crunch of leaves beneath our feet and the occasional snap of a twig breaking in the distance were the only sounds around us. It was peaceful, familiar even. I could tell my friend was enjoying the silence just as much as I was, both of us savoring the moment. It wasn't our first time walking this path, but tonight, something felt different. The wind seemed to have an extra bite to it, and the shadows that stretched across the trail appeared to linger just a little too long. It was almost as if the trees themselves were closing in on us, urging us forward into the unknown depths of the forest. I brushed off the feeling as just my imagination running wild, chalking it up to the fact that we were out later than usual, the world starting to feel a little more ominous. But that was the thing about walking into the unknown. You never really know how quickly things can change. As we moved further along the path, we noticed something odd. The usual sounds of wildlife were missing. There were no birds calling, no rustling in the bushes. The woods felt almost unnervingly silent, a silence that didn't seem natural for a place so alive with life during the day. "Have you noticed that?" my friend asked, breaking the silence between us. I looked at him, frowning. "Yeah, it's too quiet. It's like the forest has gone to sleep." He nodded in agreement, but didn't say anything more. We continued walking, the crunch of leaves the only sound that broke the silence. At that moment, I tried to shake off the unease that had started to creep in. The world was still light enough to see where we were going, and the path ahead was clear. There was no reason to worry. We pressed on, unaware that with every step, we were unknowingly walking into something that would forever change how we saw the world. Little did we know, the path ahead wasn't as empty as we thought. There was something watching us from the shadows, something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to make its presence known. The sun finally dipped below the horizon, and the world around us darkened even further. The sky above was now a deep indigo, with only the faintest hint of the last light lingering. We were far from the main trail now, and the air felt thick with the silence. It was strange, unnatural, almost how quickly the woods had become so still. There was no breeze, no rustle of leaves, just an eerie quiet that wrapped around us like a heavy cloak. I could feel my heart rate pick up, but I didn't say anything. Maybe it was just the change in light. Maybe it was just the way the forest seemed to hold its breath as night took over. But something felt wrong. My friend must have sensed it too, because he looked over at me, his eyes narrowing. "Do you think we should turn back?" he asked, his voice a little more cautious than before. I hesitated. The path ahead was still open, but the sense of unease had settled deep in my chest. Something about the place felt off, and not in the usual way when the forest becomes a little darker, a little quieter. This felt different. "We've come this far," I said, trying to sound confident. "Let's keep going a little further." We continued on, but the further we walked, the more that sense of being watched grew stronger. It was as though every step we took disturbed something ancient, something that had been there long before us. And as we moved deeper into the woods, the world outside the trees seemed to fade completely. The quiet became more intense, the air thicker. Every small noise, a distant snap of a branch, the rustle of a leaf felt magnified in the heavy silence. But it wasn't the noises that were unsettling, it was the feeling. The strange, almost palpable sensation that something was following us, that something unseen was waiting just beyond our vision. It was as if we were no longer alone in the forest. It was just a few moments later when we stopped dead in our tracks. The silence was broken, and that's when we heard a voice, faint and distant, but unmistakable. Someone know something was calling to us. The voice, it wasn't a shout, nor was it close enough to be clear. It was faint, distant, almost like a whisper carried by the wind, but it was there. I froze, my body stiffening with an instinctive response that I couldn't explain. My breath caught in my throat. I turned to my friend, who had also stopped walking. His expression mirrored mine, a look of confusion and subtle fear clouding his face. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, though I already knew he had. There was no way anyone could have missed it. He nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the shadows in front of us. The trees seemed to press in tighter, their branches twisting and reaching in strange directions. It felt as if the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. "I did," he said quietly, his voice shaking just slightly. "But it sounded like someone calling us." I looked around, my eyes darting through the trees. There was nothing there, no movement, no figure in the distance. The forest was still, just as silent and oppressive as it had been moments before. I couldn't tell if it was the winds playing tricks on my ears or if something was genuinely out there, hidden just beyond the reach of our sight. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and that gut feeling of unease started to settle deeper into my chest. "It's probably nothing," I said, trying to sound calm, even though my own voice trembled slightly. "Just the wind. The forest plays tricks on you, especially at night." But as the words left my mouth, I wasn't sure if I believed them myself. My friend wasn't so quick to dismiss it. He took a step back, looking around more intently. "I don't know, man. That didn't sound like the wind. It was too clear, too intentional." I nodded, my mind racing. He was right. The voice hadn't been a mere gust of wind, nor had it been a trick of the forest. There had been a distinct quality to it, something purposeful, something that felt directed at us. It made my skin crawl. We stood there in silence for what felt like an eternity, both of us listening for any further sounds, any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The forest around us was eerily still. I glanced at my friend again, and he seemed to be weighing his options. He looked back toward the way we had come, then at the path ahead, his gaze lingering on the darkening woods. "I think we should head back," he said after a long pause, his voice low and careful, as if he were afraid that speaking too loudly would invite something worse. "Something's not right. I don't feel good about this." I felt the same unease creeping up my spine, but I didn't want to admit it. I wasn't sure if it was fear or if I was just stubborn, but I didn't want to turn back yet. Not without knowing what was going on. The voice was too strange, too unsettling to ignore, and my curiosity was stronger than the fear. "Just a little further," I said, trying to hide the tremor in my voice. "Let's just see where this path leads. It could be nothing. It's probably some other hiker or..." But before I could finish, another sound broke through the silence, cutting me off mid-sentence. This time, it wasn't a voice. It was a sound that sent a chill through my bones, a rustling, but not like the usual rustling of leaves in the wind. No, this was different. It was heavier, closer. Someone was moving through the underbrush. I whipped my head around, my heart pounding in my chest. My friend's face had gone pale, his eyes wide with fear. He was looking in the direction of the noise, but there was nothing visible. No animal, no person, no explanation. "What the hell is that?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, but my own voice felt distant. It could be an animal, maybe. But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't. It didn't sound like an animal. The rustling was too deliberate, too calculated. Something or someone was making its way through the trees toward us, and it wasn't hiding. It was moving with purpose. We stood frozen, every muscle in my body tensed, ready to flee. My eyes scanned the darkness, trying to make sense of the situation. But the more I tried to look, the less I could see. The trees had grown thick, their branches creating a nearly impenetrable wall of shadows. The path ahead was now almost completely obscured by the night, and even the moonlight seemed to be swallowed up by the darkness of the woods. Then it came. A figure, a shadow, just barely visible against the backdrop of the trees. It wasn't a person, not entirely. It was too tall, too distorted to be human. It moved slowly, deliberately, through the trees, its shape twisting and shifting in a way that shouldn't have been possible. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a person. It was something else. Something unnatural. "Run!" I shouted, my voice cracking as the terror surged through me. Without thinking, I grabbed my friend's arm, pulling him in the opposite direction. We turned and bolted down the path, our footsteps loud in the stillness of the forest. My heart hammered in my chest, and I didn't dare look back. I could feel my friend's breath coming in ragged gasps beside me, and I knew he was just as terrified as I was. We didn't stop running until we burst into a small clearing. I couldn't tell how far we had gone, how much time had passed. All I knew was that we had to get out of that forest now. But when I finally slowed, panting heavily, I realized that something was wrong. We were no longer on the path. The clearing was unfamiliar, the trees around us twisted and distorted in a way that didn't match the forest we had just been in. It was as if the world had shifted, the landscape bending and changing around us. The air felt colder, the silence thicker. And still, I could sense that something was watching us, something just beyond the edge of our vision. I looked at my friend, his face pale and eyes wide with shock. He was trembling, his whole body stiff with fear. "Where are we?" he asked, his voice small and uncertain. This isn't the path we were on. This isn't right." I couldn't answer. I didn't know where we were, and worse, I didn't know if we'd ever get back to the trail. And that was when I heard it again. A voice, faint but unmistakable, calling from somewhere in the woods. But this time, it was clearer. It wasn't just a whisper. It was as though someone or something was standing right behind us. "Get out." We stood there in the clearing, the words from the voice still ringing in our ears. "Get out." The voice had been faint, almost drowned out by the rustling of leaves, but it was there clear as day. I could feel my body tense, my skin prickling with an invisible pressure that seemed to press in from all sides. It wasn't the sound of wind or an animal. It was something else, something that didn't belong, something that wanted us gone. My friend's face was drained of color, his eyes darting to and fro as if searching for an escape, some path back to safety. I glanced over at him, my own heart racing in my chest. This wasn't how the night was supposed to go. We hadn't come here looking for trouble. We'd simply wanted to take a walk through the forest to clear our heads. But the longer we stood there, the more the place felt wrong, unnaturally so. "What do we do?" my friend asked, his voice barely a whisper. The fear in it made my stomach tighten. It wasn't a question I had an answer for. We had no map, no compass, and no sense of direction anymore. The forest was disorienting. a labyrinth of twisted trees and shadowed paths. There was no clear way out. "We need to find the trail," I said, my voice steady, though I could feel the tremor in my hands. "It has to be nearby. If we can just find the path again, we'll be okay." I tried to sound more confident than I felt. In reality, I had no idea where we were. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, each shadow just a little deeper, every sound just a little more sinister. We had been walking for hours, and now, in this twisted clearing, it felt like time had stopped altogether. We began walking, but it wasn't the same. The ground beneath our feet felt uneven, almost spongy, like the earth was shifting with every step. The trees, once familiar, now seemed unnaturally close together, their gnarled limbs twisting overhead to form a canopy that blocked out what little moonlight had remained. The air was thick, heavy with moisture and the smell of damp earth, but there was something else in the air too, something stale, like the scent of decay, that seemed to linger just beyond the edge of my awareness. I kept my eyes on the ground as I moved, trying to focus on the simple task of putting one foot in front of the other. But the strange feeling in my gut grew stronger with every step, the sense that we were being watched. I couldn't shake the thought that something was following us, moving just out of sight, just beyond the reach of our senses. Then, without warning, a loud snap echoed from the trees behind us. We both stopped in our tracks, the sound of the breaking twigs still echoing in the stillness. I spun around, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nothing but the oppressive darkness of the forest. I tried to steady my breath, to convince myself it was just an animal, a deer or a bird that had made the noise, but my instincts told me otherwise. "Did you hear that?" my friend whispered, his voice shaking. "I did," I said, my throat dry. "We're not alone out here." I could see the panic creeping into his eyes. He was looking around wildly now, as if expecting something to jump out at him. I understood. I felt the same way. The forest had become something else, something sinister and foreign, and every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, made my heart race. We started walking faster now, our steps quick and uneven, trying to retrace our steps toward what we hoped was the trail. But the deeper we went, the less certain I felt. I could hear the crackling of the underbrush beneath our feet, but with every step, the sound felt more muffled, as though the forest was swallowing us whole. And then, out of nowhere, the voice came again, louder this time, and clearer. "Leave now." It was no longer a whisper, it was a command, sharp and forceful. I froze, my blood running cold. There was no mistaking it this time. The voice wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was something else entirely. We both turned toward the sound, but there was no one there. The forest stood as still as it had before, its shadows heavy and oppressive. But I knew it wasn't over. Something was out there, watching us, waiting for us to make a move. "Do you see anything?" my friend asked, his voice barely a breath. "No," I whispered back, my eyes scanning the darkened forest around us. I couldn't even see the stars through the thick canopy of trees anymore. It felt like we were being swallowed up by the night, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I felt a tightening in my chest, a suffocating pressure that grew stronger with every passing moment. We kept moving, but the more we walked, the more distorted the forest seemed. The trees looked different now, their shapes twisted and warped, their limbs stretching out like claws to grab at us. The underbrush rustled unnaturally, moving as if stirred by invisible hands. It was as though the forest itself was alive, breathing, pulsing with something dark and malevolent. We reached another clearing, but this one was different from the last. The trees were thinner here, spaced farther apart, allowing more light to filter through. But even in this open space, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. There was something in the air, an unease that hung over everything. I turned to my friend, hoping to reassure him, but his face had gone pale. He was staring at something, his eyes wide with terror. I followed his gaze. At first, I thought it was just another shadow, but then I saw it moving between the trees, a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its form shifting and flickering in the dim light. It wasn't human, not entirely. The shape was wrong, distorted, like a nightmare made flesh. I could feel my breath catch in my throat, my heart pounding against my ribs. We were not alone. We never had been. "Run!" I shouted, my voice breaking with fear. Without thinking, I grabbed my friend's arm and pulled him away, running blindly through the trees, not daring to look back. But even as we ran, I could feel it, that presence closing in on us, getting closer with every step. The trees around us blurred into a haze of shadows and branches, the ground uneven beneath our feet. We stumbled, tripping over roots and rocks, but we couldn't stop. We had to keep going, keep moving, or whatever that thing was would catch us. The figure, whatever it was still there, just beyond the edge of my vision. And with each passing second, it felt like it was getting closer. The pressure in the air grew heavier, more oppressive, until I could barely breathe. Then, just as I thought I couldn't run any longer, we broke free of the trees and into another clearing. But it was different. This wasn't like the other clearings. It felt wrong. I stopped dead in my tracks, my heart stopping in my chest. There, in the center of the clearing, stood a single figure. Not moving, not speaking, just standing there. It was tall, unnaturally tall, and its features were blurred, indistinct, like a reflection in a broken mirror. Its presence sent a wave of nausea through me, and I could feel my legs shaking beneath me. "What is that?" my friend whispered, his voice barely a sound. "I don't know," I replied, my own voice barely above a whisper. "But it's not human." Slowly, deliberately, it took a step forward. Time seemed to freeze as the figure took that first step toward us. The world around me blurred, the sounds of the forest growing distant, muffled, like the echoes of a dream slipping away. The cold air grew even colder, pressing against my skin as the figure moved closer. I felt as though my heart had been ripped from my chest and was now beating somewhere deep within my throat. My breaths came shallow, ragged, as I watched, utterly transfixed. It was impossible to look away. The thing in front of us wasn't human, at least not in the way we understood it. Its form was too tall, its limbs too long, its movements unnatural. The closer it came, the more its features twisted and warped. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a black void. The skin stretched tight, hollow where eyes should have been, a mouth that was nothing but a jagged, uneven slit. It felt like looking into the abyss, a void that swallowed everything, including hope. The figure was getting closer, its steps slow, deliberate, but each one brought it nearer. I could hear nothing but the thudding of my own heartbeat in my ears, and yet, in the background, there was something else, something I couldn't place, an undercurrent of sound that seemed to pulse from the figure itself. A low hum, a vibration in the air that thrummed through my chest. "Please, don't look at it," my friend whispered, his voice a pleading whimper. "Don't look at it, just look away." I wanted to listen. I wanted to turn away, to run, to escape this nightmare, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. I felt trapped in that horrible gaze, or what should have been a gaze, even though the thing had no eyes. The emptiness where they should have been seemed to reach into my soul, pulling at something deep within me, something dark and terrifying that I couldn't comprehend. "Help me," the voice came, rasping, guttural, like it was made of the forest itself. It wasn't clear if it was speaking to me or to something else, but the sound made my blood run cold. My friend recoiled, taking a step back, his face twisted with a mix of confusion and dread. "What the hell is that?" he breathed. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came out. I couldn't make sense of it either. My mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but everything felt wrong. The world felt like it was breaking apart, like the boundaries between reality and something else were blurring. And then it spoke again. "Leave!" The word was slow, heavy with a chilling finality. And yet, it wasn't just a voice. It was a feeling, a presence that filled the air, a command that echoed inside my skull. My body lurched, reacting to it as if it had physical weight. I could feel my knees buckling, my vision darkening at the edges. Fear, raw and unrestrained, coursed through me like wildfire. I tried to take a step back, but it was as if my body no longer belonged to me. My legs wouldn't obey. My hands trembled, my palms slick with sweat, as I clutched at the ground beneath me for balance. I wanted to move, to run, but the overwhelming fear in my mind was racing in 1,000 directions, each thought cut short by the deafening silence that filled the space between the two of us and the thing that was slowly advancing toward us. And then, suddenly, there was a sound, a low crack, like the earth breaking open beneath us. The ground shifted, and for the briefest moment, I thought I could feel something alive stirring beneath the dirt. It was as if the forest itself was waking, rising up around us, responding to whatever this thing was. The trees, their branches stretching toward us like arms, seemed to groan under some unseen weight. The wind picked up, but it wasn't the same wind I had felt before. It was cold, biting, like it was carrying the weight of something far darker. I turned to my friend, wanting to scream at him to run, but my voice was stuck. His face had gone pale, his lips trembling. He reached out to grab my arm, but his hand brushed mine, and his body jerked back violently, as if struck by an unseen force. I heard him choke out a cry, but I couldn't move to help him. My eyes were locked on the thing now, as if some invisible force had bound me to it. It was no longer standing still. It was coming closer, faster now, its long, spindly legs carrying it with unnatural speed. My breath caught in my throat as it reached out, its hand, or what could be described as a hand, stretching toward me. The skin on its fingers was slick, black, and smooth, like oil, with no definition, no texture. It was nothing but a strange, shifting mass. My friend screamed, a high-pitched sound that was cut off abruptly as he stumbled backward, tripping over his own feet. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. The air around us was thick with something of pressure that seemed to press down on my chest, suffocating me. The thing was almost upon us now, its outstretched hand hovering inches from my face. I could see the ragged edges of its mouth, the dark abyss where its eyes should have been, and for the first time I understood. This thing wasn't just trying to scare us. It wasn't just trying to get us to leave. I opened my mouth to scream, but before I could, the figure lunged forward, faster than I could ever have imagined, and everything went black. The world came crashing back in fragments, jagged and broken. I gasped for air, my chest heaving as I blinked in the darkness, trying to make sense of the shifting shadows around me. For a moment, everything was still. The night was silent, save for the distant rustling of leaves and the faint whisper of the wind. I could barely feel my body, as if I were floating in a space far removed from reality. I didn't know where I was, but I knew it wasn't the forest anymore. The oppressive weight that had hung in the air was gone, replaced by a hollow emptiness that seemed to stretch infinitely in all directions. My legs were shaky, my mind foggy, but I forced myself to sit up, trembling with fear and confusion. The events of the last few moments were still fresh in my mind, too fresh. My hands shook as I reached out, feeling the damp earth beneath me. I tried to push myself up, but the ground felt soft, unstable, like I wasn't meant to be standing here. The last thing I remembered was the dark figure reaching toward me, its presence overwhelming in its coldness, its hunger. And then, nothing. Darkness. But now, I was somewhere else. Somewhere that wasn't real. I struggled to get to my feet, my head spinning with every movement. The air smelled different here, fresher, almost sterile. I stumbled forward, but the ground shifted beneath me again, and I had to steady myself against the nearest tree. But this tree wasn't like the others. It didn't feel alive. Its bark was smooth, almost metallic, and the branches above were twisted in strange, unnatural shapes, like fingers reaching toward the sky. Something was wrong. Very wrong. Where am I? The words came out in a hoarse whisper. My voice felt foreign, weak, as though it didn't belong to me. The forest had been alive with an eerie presence, a sensation that clung to everything: the trees, the air, the earth itself. But now, it was gone. I wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or terrified. There were no answers here, only the gnawing sense that I had narrowly escaped something that had been waiting for me in the darkness. But had I truly escaped? The thought made me freeze. Was it over? Had the thing, whatever it was, really left? The last time I had seen it, it was so close that I could feel its cold breath on my skin, could almost taste the malice in the air. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I'd ever encountered before. I had come face to face with something otherworldly, something ancient, something far more powerful than anything I could understand. I stumbled again, the ground beneath me shifting once more. The same strange trees surrounded me, their shadows growing longer in the dim light. There was no way to tell time here. No sun, no moon. Just an endless, oppressive grayness that seemed to stretch on forever. The silence around me was deafening. And yet, I wasn't alone. The familiar scent of wet earth suddenly grew stronger, overwhelming my senses. It was the same scent I had smelled on the forest path, the scent of decay, of something that had been left to rot. I turned my head, every muscle in my body tensed with fear, expecting to see the figure again. But instead, I saw something else, a shape, a shadow, moving between the trees. I froze. The shape grew clearer as it stepped closer, revealing a figure, humanoid in appearance. My breath hitched, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to run, to flee, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure was tall, its outline distorted, like a reflection on water, rippling with every step it took. It wasn't solid, wasn't real, but it was coming toward me, moving through the grayness like it had always been there. And then, like a punch to the gut, it spoke. "Leave!" The voice wasn't the same as before. It wasn't the deep, guttural growl of the creature I had seen earlier. No, this voice was soft, almost pleading, with an undercurrent of desperation. But there was no mistaking it. This thing, whatever it was, had followed me here, into whatever world this was. I wanted to scream, to ask it what it wanted, but the words caught in my throat. All I could do was watch as it stepped closer, its form becoming more distinct with every step, yet still lacking any real definition. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything that should exist. And then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it was gone. The figure vanished into the air, as if it had never been there at all. The air grew still once more, but I knew I hadn't imagined it. Whatever that thing was, it wasn't finished with me yet. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my mind racing with questions and confusion. Had I truly escaped the forest? Had I made it out alive? Or was I simply lost in some other twisted reality? I didn't know. I couldn't know. All I had now were fragments, pieces of a nightmare I couldn't understand. I finally turned away, stumbling back through the grayness, each step feeling heavier than the last. I didn't know where I was going or how to get back, but I had to move. I had to find some way out. The feeling of being trapped, of being hunted, was too much. The weight of it pressed down on me like a 1,000-pound stone, suffocating me with every breath. As I walked, I kept my eyes trained on the ground, afraid to look up, afraid to face whatever might be waiting for me. But the more I walked, the more I realized that the path wasn't leading anywhere. There was no escape, no way out. It was as if the very air around me had turned against me, closing in, trapping me in this place forever. And then, just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I saw something. A flicker, a movement, a shadow darting between the trees. I didn't dare move toward it. I didn't dare speak, but I felt it. The presence was still there, watching, waiting. It hadn't let me go. Not really. The days that followed my escape, or what I thought was an escape, were a blur. I returned to the town, but it felt different now. Everything felt different. The familiar roads, the shops, the faces of people I had known all my life, it was all the same. And yet it wasn't a part of me knew that I had crossed the threshold, that the forest, The path, whatever that thing had been, had marked me in ways I couldn't comprehend. There were moments when I would catch myself staring at the shadows in the corners of a room, or hear a noise and freeze, expecting to see that figure looming over me once more. I tried to go back to my normal routine, to pretend everything was fine. I spoke to people, laughed at jokes, and made small talk like I had before. But inside, I was hollow. The thing in the forest, the sensation that had taken over my life during those days, lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake it, and sometimes, late at night, I would find myself staring at the ceiling, wondering if I had truly escaped or if I was still trapped somewhere, caught in a place that wasn't quite real. It was the look in the creature's eyes that stayed with me the most. The look that was both empty and full, like it was trying to say something, but I could never hear the words. It wanted me to leave, but I wasn't sure if that was a warning or an invitation. Did it want me gone, or did it want me to return? A part of me wanted to forget it all, to leave the forest behind me, to move on and live a quiet life. But another part of me couldn't let go of what had happened. What was the purpose of it all? Why had I been chosen to experience such a thing? I didn't know. I still didn't know, and that uncertainty gnawed me. The forest wasn't just a place. It wasn't just trees and shadows and winding paths. It was something more, something ancient, something that existed beyond the limits of human understanding. And I had been a part of it for a time. I had crossed a threshold that most people would never even see. That thought both comforted me and terrified me. I tried talking to others, asking if anyone had experienced anything similar, but they all looked at me as if I were insane. A bad dream, they would say. You were just lost in the woods. But I knew better. I had felt it. It wasn't a dream. It was real. Whatever had been waiting for me in that forest, whatever had touched me, it was real. It was in moments like these, when I would be alone in the quiet, that I felt the weight of the unknown pressing in on me. And sometimes, just as the shadows would lengthen at dusk, I would hear it, the rustling of leaves, the soft shifting of something just out of sight. I would turn, my heart racing, but there would be nothing there. Just the same empty path, the same quiet forest. I couldn't explain it. I couldn't make sense of it. I had survived, yes. But had I truly escaped? Or was I still being watched, still being followed by something that would never let me go? The night I returned from the forest, I thought I had left it all behind. But as the weeks went on, I realized that the forest hadn't let go of me. It was a part of me now, lingering in my mind, in my thoughts. And every now and then, when the night grew too quiet, when the wind shifted just right, I would hear that voice in my head again, soft and pleading. Leave! I didn't know if it was a warning or a command, but the one thing I knew for sure was that I would never be the same. The forest had marked me, and no matter how far I tried to run, no matter how many times I tried to bury the memory, it would always be there, waiting for me in the corners of my mind. I left that town eventually, moved to another place, another life, but I couldn't escape the feeling that it was always there somewhere in the distance, lurking, watching. The forest path had taken something from me that I would never get back. And now, every time I see a dense forest, every time I hear the wind rustling through the trees, I wonder if I will ever truly be free. The path will always be there, just beyond the horizon, waiting for the next person to come along. And maybe, just maybe, that person will be me.